Some nights, life doesn't ask if you're ready. It just happens. A billionaire stands in the London rain, looking down at a woman collapsed on the pavement. No money, no shelter, no reason left to trust anyone. He could have walked away. That would have been the easiest choice he ever made. He didn't walk away. And that was the most beautiful mistake Ethan Sterling ever made in his life. If you're watching this story, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let me see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the very end, because this one is worth it. The rain had been falling since noon. By 9 o'clock that evening, it wasn't falling anymore. It was attacking. It came down in thick, relentless sheets across central London, turning the streets into shallow rivers, sending pedestrians scrambling under awnings and into doorways, soaking through umbrellas that weren't built for weather this angry. The city, for all its grandeur and noise, had gone quiet in the way only a bad storm can make a city go quiet. Ethan Sterling noticed none of it. He sat in the back seat of his black Mercedes S-Class, jacket still buttoned, phone in hand, scrolling through an acquisition report that his legal team had sent over at 7 that evening. Numbers, projections, risk assessments, the language of money, which was the only language that had felt completely reliable to him for the past 4 years. His driver, Marcus, navigated the flooded streets with the careful precision of someone who had been driving for this particular man long enough to know that sudden stops were unwelcome and silence was preferred. The car smelled like leather and cold air. The windows were fogged slightly at the edges. "Traffic's backed up on Kensington High Street, sir," Marcus said from the front. "Accident. I'll take us around through Notting Hill." "Fine," Ethan said, without looking up. He was 32 years old, and he looked it, but only barely. There was something about the way he held himself, even seated, that added gravity to his age. Not arrogance, exactly. More like a man who had learned very early that the world moved faster than most people anticipated, and so he had simply stopped being surprised by it. He was lean, dark-haired, with the kind of jawline that photographers at business magazines always seem to find useful. He had, on 2 separate occasions, been named one of Europe's most eligible bachelors by publications he never read. He found that description faintly ridiculous. He was not eligible. He was busy. There was a difference. His phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Holloway, the woman who looked after his daughter in the evenings when his hours ran long. "Lily fell asleep at 8:15. She wanted me to tell you she saved you the last biscuit from dinner. It's on the kitchen counter. Don't forget." He read it twice. Something in his chest shifted. Not dramatically, not the way grief had moved through him in the early years, like a fist squeezing from the inside. Just a quiet, settling warmth that he'd learned to recognize as the one uncomplicated thing in his life. He typed back a quick "thank you, tell her I'll eat it first thing in the morning," and set the phone face down on his knee. Lily was 5. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and an absolute conviction that biscuits were an appropriate gift for any occasion. She was the reason he still came home. The car turned onto a narrower street, one of those old London roads that hadn't been designed with modern traffic in mind, lined on both sides with Victorian terraces and the occasional off-license with a neon sign bleeding color into the rain-slicked pavement. Marcus was slowing down, not because of traffic this time. "Sir?" Marcus's voice had changed slightly. The careful neutrality was still there, but underneath it, something careful. "There's a woman on the pavement, just ahead." Ethan looked up. She was sitting, or half-sitting, half-slumped, against the brick wall of a closed laundromat. A small duffel bag was on the ground beside her, one strap looped around her wrist, as though even in whatever state she was in, she hadn't let it go. She had no umbrella. Her dark hair was plastered flat against her face and neck. Her coat, thin, the wrong kind for November in London, was soaked through entirely, the fabric darkened with rain. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, and her head dropped forward. She wasn't moving. Ethan stared for a moment. "Stop the car." "Sir, she could be—" "Marcus, stop the car!" The Mercedes pulled to the curb. Ethan was out before Marcus had fully stopped, his jacket taking the first blast of cold rain immediately, his Italian shoes hitting a puddle that soaked through to the sock. He crossed the pavement in 4 strides and crouched down in front of her. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought, late 20s, maybe 30. Her face was pale, not sick pale, but the particular pale of someone who'd been cold and wet for too long and hadn't eaten enough to compensate. There was a fresh cut above her right eyebrow, small but still red at the edges, like she'd hit something or been knocked against something in the chaos of the storm. Her hands, still wrapped around the bag strap, were shaking. "Hey!" His voice came out quieter than he intended. He didn't reach for her. "Hey, can you hear me?" She stirred. Her head lifted slowly, like the movement cost her something. Her eyes opened. They were brown, dark brown, the color of strong tea, and for a second they were completely unfocused, blinking against the rain. Then something in them cleared, and she looked at him, and the expression on her face was not relief or gratitude. It was fear. She pulled back against the wall, tightening her grip on the bag, and the movement was so instinctive, so practiced, that it told him everything he needed to know about what kind of year she'd probably had. "I'm not—" He held both hands up, palms open. The rain was running down his face now, into his collar. "I'm not going to hurt you. You've been sitting here. It's freezing. Are you hurt?" She blinked again, took him in. The suit, the car idling at the curb behind him, Marcus standing at a respectful distance with an umbrella he'd retrieved from the boot. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been talking a lot or crying, or both, and the words came out with just enough steadiness that he could tell she was working to produce them. "You don't look fine," he said. It wasn't cruel, just direct. She seemed to consider arguing this point, and then the energy required to do so apparently exceeded what she had available. Her shoulders dropped. She looked back down at the pavement. "I just need a minute," she said quietly. "I'll move." "Move where?" She didn't answer. He stayed crouched, the rain coming down between them, and looked at her properly. The cut above her eye. The way her hands were shaking. Not just cold, but the particular tremble of someone running on empty. The bag that she hadn't let go of once, which probably meant everything she owned, was in it. He made a decision. "There's a hotel 2 streets over," he said. "We can get you inside, warm, something to eat, no strings. I'm not asking anything from you." She looked at him again. The fear was still there, but there was something else now. Exhaustion fighting with suspicion in a way that exhaustion was slowly winning. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Why would you—" "Because it's raining and you're hurt, and it's what any decent person would do." He said it plainly, without performance. "That's the whole reason, nothing else." A long moment passed. Rain hammered the pavement around them. Somewhere down the block a car horn sounded and then stopped. She looked at the car, at Marcus, who was standing very still and looking carefully at nothing in particular, back at Ethan. "I can walk," she said finally. "I know you can." He stood, and after a moment she put one hand against the wall and pushed herself upright, and he saw her wince. Her left ankle, the way she shifted her weight immediately off it, told him she twisted it, or worse. She didn't mention it. She just adjusted and straightened and hoisted the bag onto her shoulder with the practiced determination of someone who'd been dealing with worse and managing. "I'm Sophie," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just a name, offered because it seemed like the right thing to do when a stranger was being decent. "Ethan," he said. And that was how it started. Not with music or a meaningful look or any of the things that stories usually require. Just 2 people standing in the rain on a Notting Hill side street, one of them soaking wet and holding everything she owned, the other one slowly ruining a very expensive suit, and the particular quiet understanding between strangers that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, comes before something larger. 1. He didn't take her to a hotel. That had been the plan, said in good faith, but when they reached the car and she climbed in carefully, still clutching the bag, still keeping herself small in the seat the way people do when they aren't used to spaces that are comfortable, and Marcus asked for the address of the nearest suitable hotel at this hour, and Ethan looked at the time and realized it was past 9:30, and the neighborhood hotels that weren't actively grim were either full or 20 minutes in the wrong direction in this traffic, he'd said, without quite thinking it through. "Take us home." Sophie had turned to look at him. He'd caught the expression. "It's not, there's a guest suite, separate floor. You'd have your own room, your own bathroom. The full floor is yours. Mrs. Holloway is there with my daughter. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. He'd stopped, slightly annoyed at himself for the fumbling explanation, which was not a sensation he was used to. "It's late. You're injured. Let someone look at that cut. In the morning, if you want a hotel, I'll take you myself. She'd looked at him for a long time. You have a daughter, she said. Yes. How old? 5. Something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, but rearranged. She turned back to face the front windshield and the rain-smeared city passing outside it. Okay, she said quietly. The Sterling Penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a converted building in Chelsea, not the kind of building that announced itself with marble lobbies and uniformed doormen, but the kind that announced itself by not announcing itself at all, which was a different and more expensive kind of statement. The elevator required a key fob. The hallway on the upper floor was carpeted in something thick enough to absorb sound entirely. Sophie walked through it with her wet shoes leaving faint marks on the carpet and her bag still over her shoulder, and she looked at the space around her with the expression of someone doing very careful, deliberate work to keep their face neutral. Mrs. Holloway was waiting, a sturdy woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular unshakable calm of someone who had seen a great deal in a long career and had stopped being easily rattled by any of it. She took one look at Sophie, asked no questions, and produced a first aid kit, a towel, dry socks, and a bowl of soup that she reheated from what had apparently been dinner, all within about 12 minutes. The cut needs cleaning, she said, matter-of-factly, sitting across from Sophie at the kitchen island. Hold still. Sophie held still. She had the soup in one hand and Mrs. Holloway's antiseptic cotton in her field of vision, and she looked for a moment like someone who was trying very hard to figure out whether this was real. Ethan had changed his jacket and was standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water, watching at a distance that was respectful, but also, he had to admit to himself, quietly fascinated. There was something about the way she moved through a difficult situation. No dramatics, no helpless collapse. She'd accepted help in the way that people accept it when they genuinely need it, but aren't used to it, carefully, with a small held tension around the eyes, like they're waiting for the price to be named. You from London? Mrs. Holloway asked, applying the antiseptic with professional efficiency. No, Birmingham originally. Sophie winced slightly. I moved here 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks and already a London Knight's tried to eat you alive, Mrs. Holloway said, without sympathy, but also without cruelty. Just acknowledgement. Sounds about right. The city takes some adjusting to. I'm finding that out. What do you do? A pause. Ethan noticed it. Just a half-second's hesitation before Sophie answered. Graphic design. I was freelancing back home. I'm looking for full-time work here. Any luck? Another small pause. I have an interview on Monday. Good. Mrs. Holloway sat back, examined the cut with clinical satisfaction, applied a small adhesive bandage, and declared the job finished. You'll want sleep more than conversation. The guest suite is through there. Mr. Sterling will show you. There are extra blankets in the wardrobe, the shower runs hot in about 40 seconds, and the lock on the door works from the inside. She said that last part simply, as a fact, not a reassurance. But it was both. Sophie looked at her. Thank you, she said. It came out slightly rougher than she'd probably intended, like she was unused to saying it and meant it more than the words conveyed. Mrs. Holloway waved a hand dismissively and began tidying the first aid kit. Get some sleep. You look like you need about 14 hours of it. Ethan showed her the guest suite, correctly described as a separate floor's worth of privacy, with its own bathroom and a door that locked and windows that looked east over the rooftops of Chelsea, where the rain was finally beginning to ease. He pointed out the wardrobe, the extra blankets, the charger on the bedside table. He was efficient about it, which he knew was probably better than being warm, given the circumstances. At the doorway, Sophie turned. I'm not going to steal anything, she said. He looked at her. I didn't think you were. She stopped. Set the bag down on the floor inside the room. She looked tired in the way that went beyond the physical, the kind of tired that came from more than one bad night, from a stretch of things going wrong in succession until wrong became the expected state of affairs. I just want you to know I'm not the kind of person who, Sophie, his voice was quiet. You don't have to explain yourself to me. Get some sleep. She looked at him for a moment, that same careful, measuring look she'd given him on the pavement. The one that asked the question that experience had apparently taught her to always ask. What does this person want from me? He didn't give her an answer because the answer was nothing, and that apparently wasn't something she'd learned yet to take at face value. So he just said goodnight and pulled the door halfway shut and walked back down the hall. He stood in his own kitchen for a moment, finishing the glass of water, and let himself think about what he'd just done. Brought a stranger home. To the home where his daughter slept. He ran that through the filter of reasonable judgment, and it came out, on balance, fine, Mrs. Holloway had been there. Sophie was clearly not dangerous, just struggling, and the alternative had been leaving her in the rain with a cut on her face and no clear place to go, which was not something he was willing to do. But that wasn't the whole of what he was thinking about. What he was also thinking about was the look on her face when she'd said, "I'm not the kind of person who," and stopped herself. The way that sentence had gone unfinished because she wasn't sure how to complete it, or maybe because she was afraid the completion of it would sound like something she was trying to prove rather than simply stating. He washed the glass, set it on the rack, turned off the kitchen light. He went to check on Lily, standing in the doorway of her room, listening to the small, steady sound of his daughter breathing in the dark. The nightlight casting its usual pale orange glow over the pile of stuffed animals she required for sleep, and the biscuit she'd apparently forgotten to actually save him, but the sentiment of which had been communicated via Mrs. Holloway. He stood there for about 30 seconds, which was long enough to remember what actually mattered. Then he went to bed. He was up at 6, which was his habit, and by 6:15 he was in the kitchen with coffee and the morning papers on his phone, working through the night's emails from his New York office. By 7, Lily was awake. He heard her before he saw her, the particular uneven footfall of a 5-year-old who had not yet mastered the art of quiet mornings. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the small hedgehogs on them, hair going in approximately 4 directions, holding a stuffed rabbit called Gerald that had seen better years and better washing cycles. "Daddy?" "Morning, Bug." She climbed onto the kitchen stool, settled Gerald on the counter with the authority of someone assigning seating at a state dinner, and looked at him with the focused brown eyes that were unambiguously her mother's. "Mrs. Holloway said there's a lady staying in the guest room." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "That's right." "Why?" "Because she needed somewhere safe to sleep, and we had a room." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone weighing complex moral positions. "Is she okay?" "She will be." "Did she have a boo-boo?" "Small one. Mrs. Holloway fixed it." "Good." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied with both the logic and the outcome. "Can I have cereal?" He was pouring it when he heard footsteps, lighter than Mrs. Holloway's, slower than Lily's. And Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd clearly slept, but not deeply. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't faded with the night. She was wearing the same clothes, which made sense because those were the only clothes she had. Her hair was pulled back. The small bandage on her eyebrow was still white and clean. She was barefoot, which made her look younger than she had in the rain. She stopped when she saw Lily, and Lily turned on her stool and looked at this stranger in her kitchen with the complete unfiltered assessment of a 5-year-old, which lasted about 4 seconds. "Your name is Sophie," Lily announced. Not a question. Sophie blinked. Yes. How did you—" "Daddy told me. I'm Lily. That's Gerald." She pointed to the rabbit. "He doesn't talk, but he understands everything." Sophie's face did something then that Ethan couldn't quite name. It was there for just a second, a kind of unprepared, undefended warmth, before she collected herself. "Gerald sounds like a good listener," she said. "He is," Lily agreed seriously. "Do you want cereal? We have 2 kinds, the boring one and the one with the little marshmallows. Daddy only lets me have the marshmallow one on weekends, but today is—" She turned to Ethan. "Daddy, what day is today?" "Tuesday." Lily turned back to Sophie with the look of someone conveying regrettable information. "Tuesday. So boring one." "I love the boring one," Sophie said. "It's underrated." Lily stared at her. "What's underrated?" "It means something is actually better than people think it is." Lily turned this over. She said, with the tone of someone who was not fully convinced but willing to revisit the matter. "Okay, sit down then." And Sophie sat down. Ethan watched this exchange from his position at the counter and said nothing, which was the correct choice. He poured a third bowl of cereal, the boring kind, and set it in front of Sophie with the milk, and she looked at it and then at him and said quietly, "Thank you for all of this. Don't mention it." "I mean it." He met her eyes briefly. "I know you do." It was an ordinary morning, kitchen sounds and cereal and a 5-year-old explaining to a stranger the complex inner life of a stuffed rabbit, and the rain from the night before drying on the windows outside. Ordinary in all the ways that an unusual situation can produce ordinary moments if you let it. He let it, but she left at 9:30. He'd offered to call her a cab and she'd accepted. He had the sense she was calibrating her acceptances carefully, taking what she genuinely needed and refusing what might tip the balance into obligation. The cab was fine, breakfast was fine. When he'd offered to have Marcus take her wherever she needed to go, she'd shaken her head. "You've already done too much," she said at the door, bag over her shoulder again. Lily was in the hallway behind him, still holding Gerald, watching with frank interest. "Where's the interview?" he asked. "Monday." "You said Monday." She looked at him, slightly surprised that he'd remembered. "Sterling Global, in Canary Wharf." She said it with a small trace of something that might have been nerves disguised as practicality. "Creative department. It's a long shot, but—" "It's not a long shot," he said. She almost smiled. It was the almost that got him. The beginning of something that stopped just short of arrival. "You don't know my portfolio." "No," he said, "but I know how you handle yourself. That's usually more predictive." She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked away, down at the floor, in the particular way people look away when something has landed closer to home than they expected. "Good luck," he said. "Thanks." She looked at Lily. "Bye, Lily. Take care of Gerald." "Gerald takes care of me," Lily corrected with absolute seriousness. Sophie did smile then. A real one, brief, unguarded, the kind that had nothing to do with being polite. She turned and walked toward the elevator. Ethan watched the elevator doors close. Beside him, Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy?" "Yes." "I like Sophie." He looked down at his daughter, who was looking at the elevator with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who hadn't yet learned to qualify her opinions or wait for more evidence. "You just met her," he said. "So?" Lily said. She wasn't wrong, he thought. He'd known her for less than 12 hours, and she was already occupying a specific, defined space in his thinking. Not romantically, he told himself, or maybe not entirely honestly, but there was something about her. The way she'd held that bag in the rain, the way she'd sat in his kitchen and talked to his daughter about the underrated qualities of plain cereal, the way she'd said, "I'm not the kind of person who," and left the sentence unfinished because she didn't yet trust that finishing it would be believed. Something about that had stayed with him in the precise way that things stay with you when they matter before you've decided whether to let them. He closed the front door. "Come on," he said to Lily. "Let's finish breakfast." Monday morning came fast. He'd thought about it twice over the weekend. The Sterling Global interview, the name she'd said with careful casualness. He could have mentioned it, could have said, "I own that company, I could call someone." He hadn't. He didn't know why exactly, except that it felt wrong, like intercepting something she needed to do herself, like removing a difficulty she'd chosen to face on her own terms. So he said nothing. He was in his office on the 31st floor of the Sterling Global building at 9:15 when his assistant Claire put her head around the door. "The creative department shortlist is this morning," she said. 15 candidates. HR says they've had a strong pool." "Good," he said, and turned back to the document in front of him. He didn't think about it again until 11, when he was in a meeting with his senior marketing team, and someone mentioned that one of the morning's interview candidates had come in with a presentation portfolio that 3 of the creative directors had spent 20 minutes discussing after she left the room. "Which candidate?" Ethan asked. His marketing director checked his notes. "Bennett. Sophie Bennett." The room continued its meeting around him. He sat very still for about 3 seconds, during which he processed several things simultaneously, and then he said, "Remind them the final decision goes through standard process," and moved on to the next agenda item. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't know, yet, what there was to tell. But that afternoon, when the HR department sent through the shortlisted offers, and Sophie Bennett's name was on the confirmed list, senior creative associate, starting the following Monday, probationary period, competitive package, He read it twice, and for the first time in a long time, he found that he was curious about what came next. Not about the business, about her. Bote. The city outside his window was doing what London always did in November, gray and wet and perpetually in the process of almost being night, when his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't have saved. "This is Sophie. Mrs. Holloway gave me your number. I hope that's okay. I just wanted to say I got the job. At the company whose name I didn't realize belonged to you until I walked into the lobby and saw your name on the building, which was a genuinely awkward moment. Anyway, thank you. For the cereal and the cab and the roof, that's all." He read it, smiled, not the controlled, presentable version he wore in meetings, but the brief, real one that appeared sometimes when he wasn't managing it. He typed back, "Congratulations, you got it on your own. I had nothing to do with it." A pause. Then, "How do I know that?" He thought about it. Then, "You'll figure it out." Another pause, longer this time. And then, finally, "Okay, just okay." One word, sent after enough of a delay to mean she'd thought about it, weighed it, and decided, tentatively, conditionally, with all the caution of someone who had been wrong before, to believe him. He set the phone down. Outside, London went on in its rain-gray November way, indifferent and enormous, and full of 10,000 stories happening simultaneously in its wet streets. One of them was just beginning. She showed up on Monday at 8:45, not 8:50, not 9 on the dot. 8:45, which told Ethan something about her before he ever saw her walk through the door of Sterling Global's creative floor. He wasn't watching for her. That was what he told himself. He happened to be passing through the atrium on his way from a breakfast meeting when he saw her at the reception desk, filling out her new hire paperwork with a pen she'd brought herself because the desk pen had run out of ink, and she'd apparently noticed this before the receptionist had. She was wearing a dark green blazer over a plain black shirt, dark trousers, shoes that were clean but not new. Her hair was down. The small bandage above her eyebrow was gone, leaving just a faint pink line at the edge of it that she hadn't covered with makeup. She didn't look like someone trying to appear as though she belonged. She just looked like someone who had decided she was going to. He kept walking. He didn't stop, didn't make himself known. This was her first day, and she'd earned it cleanly, and the last thing she needed was her new employer materializing in the lobby to remind her of the complicated way they'd met. He took the elevator to his floor, sat down at his desk, and opened his calendar. He did not think about the green blazer. Much. The creative department at Sterling Global occupied the 24th floor. Open plan, with the particular organized chaos of a space where people were paid to have ideas and then were immediately required to make those ideas commercially viable, which was a tension that never fully resolved but produced, on balance, good work. There were whiteboards covered in diagrams on every available wall surface. There were plants that were doing their best under fluorescent lighting. There was a coffee machine that was the subject of more daily negotiation than most of the company's client contracts. Sophie's desk was between a senior designer named James, who was 35, perpetually caffeinated, and had the energy of someone who found everything professionally fascinating, and a brand strategist named Priya, who was sharp and efficient and had, within her first 3 minutes of meeting Sophie, correctly identified that Sophie was trying very hard to appear calm. "You're holding your coffee with both hands," Priya said, not looking up from her screen. "Either you're cold or you're nervous." "Can't it be both?" Sophie said. "Fair." Priya clicked something on her keyboard. "First week is the worst. Then it gets complicated in different ways. Welcome to Sterling." James spun around in his chair. He had the kind of face that was always slightly mid-expression, like he was perpetually in the middle of reacting to something. "You're the one they pulled from the morning shortlist, right? The presentation thing?" Sophie looked at him carefully. "What presentation thing?" Word got around that someone came in with a brand identity concept for the Morrison account, and 3 of the creative directors spent the whole lunch break arguing about it. He said it with honest admiration rather than resentment, which she hadn't expected. "That was yours?" "I didn't know it was the Morrison account," she said. "I just saw the brief they gave candidates, and it felt wrong. The direction they were going with it felt like it was talking at the audience instead of to them, so I reframed it." James stared at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what they argued about. The first week was hard in the way that first weeks are always hard. The accumulation of small unfamiliarities adding up to a constant background hum of effort, learning the systems, the processes, the unwritten protocols about which meeting rooms were actually available, despite what the calendar said, and whose coffee mug was absolutely not communal property. Learning who knew what they were doing and who was good at appearing to know what they were doing, which was a different skill set entirely. Sophie kept her head down and her work quality high, which was the only strategy she had available. She was good. She knew she was good, had always known it, which was one of the few things that hadn't been dismantled by the previous year's events. But good didn't mean much if you couldn't prove it in a new environment where nobody had any reason to trust you yet. She proved it. By the end of her second week, she'd quietly redesigned a client presentation that her team lead had asked her to just clean up a little into something that the account manager described, with barely concealed surprise, as the best-looking deck they'd sent out in 6 months. She hadn't told anyone she was doing more than cleaning it up. She'd just done it. Priya noticed. James noticed. Her team lead, a careful woman named Diana, who didn't give compliments cheaply, said good work, in the tone of someone who meant it precisely and nothing more, which Sophie understood was the equivalent of a standing ovation from Diana's particular register. What Sophie didn't know, because there was no way she could have known, was that the Morrison account presentation had been forwarded to Ethan's desk by his head of creative with a note that said, "New hire. Bennett, you should see this." He'd looked at it on a Tuesday afternoon between calls. He'd looked at it for longer than he'd planned to. The work was good. Genuinely good. Not just technically competent, but conceptually sharp. The kind of thinking that came from someone who actually understood what she was solving for rather than just executing a brief. The reframe she'd made was exactly right, and the way she'd presented it, clean, confident, no unnecessary ornamentation, told him that she knew it was right. Not arrogantly, just clearly. He'd set it down, turned back to his afternoon, and said nothing. She didn't need to know he'd seen it. That wasn't the point. The point, he told himself, was simply that she was good at her job and the company had made a good hire. That was all. Clean and uncomplicated, and having absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he'd thought about her, more than once, during the 2 weeks since she'd walked out of his front door and into a cab. He was very certain about that. The first time their professional paths actually crossed, properly crossed, not the distant orbit of executive floor and creative floor in the same large building, was at the end of her third week, during a cross-department review for the Hartley campaign. The Hartley account was significant, a luxury retail group expanding its digital presence in 4 new European markets, looking to Sterling Global to build the brand strategy from the ground up. It was the kind of account that could anchor a quarter, and the kind of account that Ethan attended the reviews for personally, which meant that when Sophie walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 28th floor and saw him already seated at the head of the table, she stopped for approximately 1/2 second before continuing to her chair. He saw it. He said nothing. The review proceeded the way these things proceeded. Presentations, numbers, questions, the careful political choreography of people who knew that decisions made in this room had real consequences and were trying to appear both decisive and collaborative simultaneously. It was the kind of meeting that Sophie had attended in smaller versions at smaller companies and had always found slightly exhausting, not because the work was hard, but because the performance around the work required a separate and draining kind of energy. She sat through 3 presentations before Diana gestured to her. "Bennett, walk them through the consumer positioning framework you developed." Sophie stood. She hadn't been told she'd be presenting today. This was the thing about Diana. She operated on the principle that people did their best unrehearsed work when they hadn't had time to smooth all the interesting edges off it. It was an approach that Sophie found both professionally aggravating and, on some level, correct. She stood, pulled up the framework on the room's central screen, and talked through it. No notes. Just the work, which she knew well enough that the knowing was in her hands and her voice, and the way she moved through the logic of it, point by point, without decoration. She talked about the target consumer segment with the specificity of someone who had actually thought about them as people rather than demographics. She talked about the emotional territory the brand needed to occupy and why the current direction was landing 3 feet to the left of it. She talked for 7 minutes. When she stopped, the room was quiet for a moment in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has landed. Ethan was watching her from the head of the table. He'd been watching her for most of the 7 minutes, which she was aware of and which she'd decided to simply not factor into her performance of the task at hand. The gap you're describing between the brand's self-image and the consumer's actual perception, he said. His voice was level, genuinely curious rather than challenging. What's your proposal for closing that? Honestly? She held his gaze. Stop trying to close it from the brand side. The consumer perception is actually more accurate than the brand's self-image. The brand needs to catch up to what people already think they are, not the other way around. A beat. That's a significant shift from the direction the account team was planning, said the head of strategy, a man named Richard who had a way of phrasing disagreement as neutral observation. I know, Sophie said. I think the current direction is wrong. Another beat, slightly longer. Ethan looked down at the framework on the screen, then back at her. Something in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Walk us through the evidence for that assessment, he said. So she did. For another 4 minutes, with the particular focused calm of someone who had done the work and was prepared to stand behind it, she walked them through it. When she sat down, Priya, seated 2 chairs away, passed her a note on the corner of a notepad page that said simply, "You just told Richard he was wrong in front of the CEO and didn't flinch. Iconic." Sophie folded the note and put it in her pocket. After the meeting, in the corridor, she was heading toward the elevator when she heard her name. She turned. Ethan was behind her, jacket still buttoned, a folder in his hand, walking with the unhurried purpose of someone who had somewhere specific to be but wasn't rushing to get there. The positioning framework, he said when he reached her. It was good. The instinct about reversing the direction? It's right. She looked at him, tried to figure out, as she always did with him, whether there was something underneath the plain surface of what he was saying. She hadn't fully stopped doing that since the first night, and she was aware this said more about her recent history than about him. Thank you, she said. Richard's going to push back in the follow-up. I know. You should be prepared for it. I am. He studied her for a moment, not unkindly. The way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand accurately. You got in at 8:45 your first day, he said. She blinked. You noticed that? I was passing through. Right. A small pause. I was nervous. I know. You didn't show it. I showed it to Priya within about 4 minutes. Something that might have been amusement passed across his face. Good, he said, in a tone that suggested he meant it, that he thought showing it to Priya was better than showing it to nobody. How's the ankle? The question caught her off guard. The ankle had been fine for 2 weeks. The fact that he'd remembered it, that small, unceremonious question, embedded in the professional conversation like it was the most natural thing, landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for. Fine, she said. Good. I barely notice it. He nodded. Good. He shifted the folder to his other hand. The Hartley account review is next Thursday. I'd like your framework in the pre-read this time, not as a surprise. Diana surprises people on purpose, Sophie said, before she could stop herself. I know she does, he said. I'd still like it in the pre-read. And he walked away toward the elevator, and she stood in the corridor for a moment and thought, this is complicated. Then she went back to her desk and worked for 3 more hours and made herself stop thinking about it. She was not entirely successful. The weeks that followed had a shape to them, the shape of days finding their rhythm, which was a thing Sophie hadn't had for most of the past year, and which she was learning, slowly, to trust. She woke up early, took the tube to Canary Wharf, worked, came home to her small rented room in a flat she shared with 2 other people she barely saw, ate whatever was fast and inexpensive, and did it again. On weekends, she worked on freelance projects to cover the gap between her rent and her salary, which was decent but not yet comfortable. She didn't think much about the room. It was small, and the heating was unreliable, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her flatmate's television through them. But it was hers, in the specific way that a thing you pay for yourself is yours, and that mattered to her in a way that was hard to explain to people who'd never had the alternative. At work, she was building something, a reputation, small and early and fragile, but real. The Morrison account picked up her positioning framework over the existing direction, which produced a reaction from Richard that was exactly as politically complicated as Ethan had predicted, and which she navigated by simply continuing to be right about the work, which was the only strategy available that didn't require compromising the work itself. The Hartley pre-read went in on time, annotated, with supporting data she'd sourced herself over a weekend. James started sending her drafts for a second opinion before he sent them to Diana, which was a form of professional trust she recognized and took seriously. She was, for the first time in over a year, okay. Not happy, exactly. She wasn't sure she'd earned that word yet, wasn't sure the soil was stable enough to let it grow in properly. But okay, moving, forward-facing in a way she hadn't been. She didn't think much about Ethan. She thought about him at a reasonable professional frequency that was definitely not excessive. She saw him in meetings, cross-department reviews, one full team all hands, where he spoke for 15 minutes with the measured precision of someone who was good at this and knew it without needing to perform it, a corridor exchange here and there. He was always direct, always professional, never warm in a way that blurred the lines, except for one Thursday afternoon, 5 weeks in. She was in the building's ground floor cafe, eating lunch at 11:50 because she'd skipped breakfast and couldn't make it to 12, sitting with her salad and her phone and a brief she was annotating in the margins with a pen when the chair across from her was pulled out and Lily sat down in it. Sophie looked up. Lily was wearing her school uniform, navy pinafore, white shirt, one sock higher than the other, and was carrying a backpack that appeared to contain, based on the lumpy outline, both textbooks and an unreasonable number of soft toys. Behind her, at a slight distance, was a woman Sophie didn't recognize, mid-40s, competent-looking, clearly in the role of school pickup. "Sophie," Lily said, with the tone of someone who had accomplished a thing they had planned. "Lily." Sophie stared at her. "How are you? What are you doing here?" "Daddy said I could come see where he works," Lily said. "We saw you through the window." She pointed at the cafe's glass front wall. "I told Ms. Chen." "I'm so sorry," said the woman, Ms. Chen, from behind Lily's shoulder. She had the expression of someone who had tried and failed to intercept this situation. She was very determined. "It's fine," Sophie said, and she meant it. Something about Lily's complete, uncalculating certainty, "I saw Sophie, so I went to Sophie," made it impossible to be anything other than fine. She pulled the chair out properly. "Sit down, then." Lily sat down with the authority of someone claiming territory. She set her backpack on the floor, organized it so the zip was accessible, and folded her hands on the table in a way that was uncannily reminiscent of her father. "I like your building," she announced. "It's very tall. Can you see the river from up there?" "From some of the floors, yes." "I want to see the river." "Maybe ask your dad." Lily considered this. "He'll say it depends on his meetings." "Then it depends on his meetings." Lily sighed with the full theatrical weight of a 5-year-old confronting the bureaucracy of adult schedules. "That's what he always says." Then, changing direction entirely with the velocity that was apparently her natural mode. "Do you like it here? Working here?" Sophie looked at her. "I do," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it without qualification. "Daddy says you're very good at your job." Sophie went still. "He said that?" "He said the presentation framework thing was very sharp." Lily delivered this with the tone of someone who had memorized the exact phrasing. "I don't know what a presentation framework is, but sharp is a good thing. Gerald is sharp. He has excellent instincts." She paused. "Those are Daddy's words." "About Gerald." Sophie laughed. It came out of her before she had time to manage it. Genuine, unprepared, the kind of laugh that happens when something is so specifically unexpected that your face doesn't have time to negotiate the appropriate level of reaction. She hadn't laughed like that in a while. "Gerald has excellent instincts," she repeated. I believe that completely." "He's in my bag," Lily offered in the tone of someone making an important resource available. "I appreciate that." They sat together for 10 minutes while Ms. Chen waited with professional patience, and Lily ate a biscuit she produced from her backpack, the kind with the chocolate stripe that was not, strictly speaking, a nutritionally appropriate lunch snack, and told Sophie in detailed sequential order about a project she was doing in school about frogs. The level of detail about frogs was extraordinary. Sophie gave it her full attention. When Ethan appeared in the cafe doorway, he took in the scene for a moment before approaching. His daughter at Sophie's table, Sophie leaning forward with both elbows on the table, listening to what was apparently a very important point about tadpoles. The expression on Sophie's face, one he hadn't seen before. Open. Unguarded. The particular face of someone who was genuinely present rather than performing presence. "Lily," he said from the threshold. Lily looked up. I found Sophie, she reported. I see that. She laughed, Lily added, as though this was a relevant data point for his assessment of the situation. He looked at Sophie. Sorry about this. Don't be, Sophie said, and she said it with the flatness of genuine sincerity, not social politeness. Something shifted in his expression, sir, brief, contained, but there. He glanced at Ms. Chen. 5 more minutes, he said. Then he looked at Sophie. Unless 5 minutes is fine, she said. He sat down. Not across from her. Lily had that seat, but in the chair beside her, at the corner of the small table, which placed them at a proximity that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but somewhere in the understated geography between the two. He ordered a coffee he didn't particularly need from the counter staff and sat with it and let Lily continue the frog presentation, which apparently was not finished. At some point, between the section on metamorphosis and Lily's strong opinions about which stage was objectively the most interesting, the in-between part, she said, because that's when everything is changing, but you can't see it yet. Ethan and Sophie were both quiet for a moment, and he said low enough that Lily was occupied with her biscuit and not listening. She talked about you last week, several times. Sophie looked at her coffee cup. Kids latch onto things. She doesn't, usually. She's actually quite selective. He said it without sentimentality, just as observation. She has good instincts about people. Like Gerald, Sophie thought, and pressed her lips together to keep the smile from arriving at the wrong moment. She's wonderful, Sophie said quietly. You've done a good job with her. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. I've tried, he said. Some days that's clearer than others. She turned to look at him and found that he was already not looking at her. Looking at Lily instead, the expression on his face something she couldn't quite name but recognized in the abstract. The particular way a person looks at the one thing they're absolutely certain they haven't gotten wrong. She understood that look. She just hadn't seen it directed at anything in her own life for a very long time. They didn't talk about the rain. They didn't talk about the night in November, or the morning after, or the cereal, or the cab. It sat in the room with them the way shared history sits in rooms, present, acknowledged by neither party, belonging to both of them anyway. Miss Chen checked her watch. Lily finished her biscuit and wiped her hands on her pinafore in a way that suggested this was a habit Mrs. Holloway was actively working against. Ethan stood, buttoned his jacket with the automatic precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times. 5 more minutes turned into 20, he said to Sophie. I noticed. Sorry. Stop apologizing for her. She's the best part of my Thursday. He looked at her for a moment, and then quietly, Mine too. He said it about Lily. It was about Lily. She was certain about that, and yet the words sat in the air between them for just a half second too long to be purely informational, and then he was turning away and telling Lily it was time, and Lily was performing a brief but theatrical farewell that involved a handshake for Sophie and a separate handshake for the empty chair where Gerald had been deemed spiritually present. Sophie sat alone at the cafe table and looked at her annotated brief and her half-eaten salad and the window the rainy London street ran past outside. She was not thinking about him. She was thinking about work. The Hartley follow-up, the Morrison rollout, the 3 emails she had to return before 4 o'clock. Practical things. Real things. The kind of things that filled up a day and kept the other things at the appropriate distance. She packed up her bag, put on her jacket, and went back upstairs. The following weeks, the professional entanglement deepened. Naturally, incrementally, the way it does when 2 people are competent at the same things and have been put in proximity by circumstances that were initially coincidental and are becoming less so. He pulled her into the Hartley steering committee. Not Diana's recommendation, his, directly, which caused a small, carefully suppressed ripple of interest through the 24th floor that Priya reported to Sophie with the precision of an intelligence officer and the enthusiasm of someone who found this professionally delightful. He never pulls junior associates into steering committees, Priya said, at her desk, not looking up from her screen in a way that suggested she was watching Sophie's reaction very carefully out of her peripheral vision. I'm not junior, Sophie said. I'm new. That's technically distinct, but functionally similar in this building. The framework was good. The framework was excellent, Priya said. There have been excellent frameworks before. They don't usually get their authors into the steering committee. Sophie turned back to her own screen. Can we talk about something else? Of course, Priya said warmly. Absolutely. What would you like to talk about? A 5-second pause. I was thinking about the Hartley consumer segmentation, Sophie said. Right, Priya said. That's what I thought. In the steering committee, Sophie was careful. She did her work, spoke when she had something to say, said it clearly, and kept the register cleanly professional. She was good at this, at the deliberate separation of the personal from the operational, at the maintenance of the correct distance. She'd had years of practice at it. What she was less prepared for was the Thursday evening in early January when the steering committee ran late, past 7, which the meetings did occasionally, the particular London winter dark already fully established outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. And Ethan stopped the meeting to order food for the room, the way he did apparently without particular ceremony, and somehow 30 minutes later they were the last 2 people left in the conference room, everyone else having taken their meals and their laptops to other locations. And there was a container of Thai food between them and a campaign analysis that had no particular urgency and the quiet of an office in the evening, which is a different kind of quiet than any other. You grew up in Birmingham, he said. Not a question. She'd mentioned it to Mrs. Holloway that first night, and he'd apparently stored it. Hockley, she said. Small street off the main road, council estate. She said it without defense and without apology, which was something she'd had to practice. Not exactly a launching pad for a design career in London. But here you are. Here I am. She stabbed a piece of chicken with the plastic fork. It took a while. I had a detour. She hadn't meant to say that. The word detour was the polite version of a thing that wasn't polite. A year of her life that she'd lost to someone who hadn't deserved any of it. A series of decisions made from the wrong place that had landed her on a wet pavement in Notting Hill in November. He didn't press. He picked up his own fork and said, What kind of detour? She looked at him, made the assessment she always made, the one that was getting harder to justify, because every data point she'd collected in 3 months pointed in the same direction. I was with someone, she said, for 2 years. I thought we were building something, and then I found out we weren't. He was. She paused. He was building something else, with someone else, while I was under the impression that what he told me was what was actually happening. He cheated on you. Extensively, she said, with a flatness that was worse than bitterness because it was so thoroughly post-bitterness, the drained, exhausted aftermath of having been angry for so long that the anger burned through and left something quieter and more permanent behind. I'm sorry, Ethan said. Don't be. It's done. She looked at her food. The worst part was the aftermath, not the discovery. The discovery was clean. The afterwards is when you have to figure out how much of what you thought was real actually was. And the answer is, some of it was real, which is almost harder than if none of it had been, because then you'd know exactly what you were working with. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, London was doing its evening thing. Lit windows in the buildings across the water, a plane blinking its slow path across the dark. My wife died, he said. 4 years ago, Clara. Sophie looked at him. Heart. She was 28. He said it with the particular careful steadiness of someone who has told the story enough times that the telling of it has become manageable without becoming small. She was... He paused. She was wonderful. She was funny in a way that took you by surprise. She made terrible coffee and refused to acknowledge that she made terrible coffee. A beat. Lily has her eyes. I know, Sophie said quietly. I could see that. From pictures. She stopped. I wasn't snooping. There's one in the hallway. From the night I know which one, he said. They sat with it for a moment. The thing you said, he said, about figuring out how much of what you thought was real. I know that from a different direction. When someone's gone, you spend a lot of time reconstructing, re-examining every conversation, every day, trying to figure out if you said the right things, if you were present enough. And the answer is always that you weren't, quite, because nobody ever is. But you still do the math. Sophie set down her fork. She looked at him directly, which was something she'd been managing carefully for months, because looking at him directly produced an effect she was not ready to accommodate. You've done that, she said. The math. Many times, he said. I don't do it as much anymore. What changed? He was quiet for a moment. honest consideration. Not the pause of someone performing thoughtfulness, but the real kind. The pause of someone actually locating the answer. Lily, he said. She needed me to stop reconstructing the past and actually show up for the present. Kids are very unambiguous about that requirement. Sophie smiled. Small, true. She told me the in-between stage of tadpoles is the most interesting, she said, because that's when everything is changing, but you can't see it. She's been saying that for 2 weeks, he said. I have no idea where she got it. Probably a book. It's not wrong, though. No, he said. It's not. They finished the food and the analysis, and he called Marcus for the car and offered her a lift because the tube at this hour in January was its own particular experience, and she thought about declining for the 3 seconds it took her to remember that declining for the sake of maintaining a distance that was becoming increasingly artificial was its own kind of dishonesty. Okay, she said. In the car, Lily asleep upstairs at home, the city running past the windows. They talked. Not about work, not about the past, just the ordinary lateral things that people talk about when they're learning each other without naming the learning. Books. Bad television they'd watched for reasons they couldn't entirely defend. The specific cruelty of the London tube in winter. Whether the boring cereal actually was underrated. It is, Sophie said. I stand by that. It's objectively bland, Ethan said. Bland isn't bad. Bland is consistent, reliable. You know exactly what you're getting. He looked at her from the other corner of the back seat, and there was something in his expression, the brief, real version of whatever he usually kept managed, that was there for a moment and then gone. That's a very specific endorsement of something extremely ordinary, he said. I've had enough extraordinary, Sophie said. For now. Ordinary is what I needed. The car pulled up outside her building. She got out, pulled her coat against the cold, turned back to say goodnight through the open door. Sophie, he said. She looked at him. For what it's worth, he said, what you've built here in 3 months, it's not ordinary, not even close. She stood in the cold January air and looked at him and did not have a clean, safe answer ready, which was the most honest response she could have given. Good night, Ethan, she said. She walked up the steps to her building and didn't look back, which cost her something, and she didn't particularly examine what. Inside her small room, with the thin walls and the unreliable heating and the sound of her flatmate's television through the partition, she sat on the edge of her bed for a moment in the dark and let herself be honest about it, just for a minute, just to herself. She was in trouble. Not the bad kind. Or maybe exactly the bad kind. She wasn't sure yet which, and that uncertainty was its own specific, complicated thing. Not entirely unwelcome, not entirely safe, like standing at the edge of something and not yet knowing whether to step. She took off her coat, hung it up, and went to make tea. Outside, London sat in its winter cold, enormous and indifferent as ever, full of its 10,000 concurrent stories, and in one of them, a man sat in the back of a car on the way home to his sleeping daughter, not looking at his phone for once, looking at the city instead, and thinking about ordinary things in a way that felt, inexplicably and despite everything, like the beginning of something. February arrived the way it always did in London, without announcement, without improvement, just the same cold and gray continuing from January with a slight change in the calendar. The city had the particular exhausted quality of a place that had been winter for too long, and wasn't yet close enough to spring to have anything to look forward to. Sophie noticed none of it, or at least she told herself she didn't. She was, by February, genuinely embedded at Sterling Global in the way that mattered, not just competent on paper but trusted in practice, which was a different and more durable thing. The Hartley campaign had moved from steering committee to execution phase, and her consumer positioning framework had become the structural spine of the entire brand rollout, which meant that 3 senior strategists who had been skeptical 4 months ago were now using her language in their presentations, occasionally without attribution, which Priya pointed out with the precise indignation of someone who took professional credit very seriously on Sophie's behalf. Richard used your exact phrase in the client call this morning, Priya said, dropping into Sophie's chair with the energy of someone delivering urgent intelligence. The one about the brand catching up to consumer perception. Didn't say where it came from. It's fine, Sophie said. It's not fine, it's Priya. If Richard using my phrase means the campaign goes in the right direction and the client is happy, that's the outcome I want. I'm not here to collect attribution on terminology. Priya stared at her for a moment. You're annoyingly evolved about professional politics. I'm tired, Sophie said. There's a difference. She was tired. The work was good, and the work was hers, and she was proud of it, but the pace had been relentless since January, and she hadn't been sleeping cleanly. The problem wasn't the work. The problem was that she had made the honest admission to herself 6 weeks ago in her small rented room that she was in some species of trouble with regard to Ethan Sterling, and she had done absolutely nothing constructive about it since then, except continue to work in his company, attend his meetings, and sit in his car twice more when the steering committee ran late, and the offer was made in the same level, uncomplicated way it had been made the first time. She had told herself each time that it was practical. Transportation. Adult and reasonable, and having nothing to do with the fact that she'd started to know the particular rhythm of how he talked when he was tired versus how he talked when he was engaged, or the way he asked questions differently when he already suspected the answer, or that he took his coffee without sugar, but added it to Lily's hot chocolate with a precision that suggested he'd memorized exactly how much she wanted. She told herself that this knowledge was incidental, accumulated without intention, the natural byproduct of proximity. She was lying to herself, and she knew it, and she had made a private decision that this was acceptable as long as she kept it private and kept the work clean and let whatever it was remain in the territory of unnamed things, which was the only safe territory available. This was the plan. The plan lasted until the second Friday of February, when Lucas Carter walked back into her life through the front door of a coffee shop 4 blocks from her office. She hadn't seen him in 8 months. The last time, she'd been in Birmingham still, in the flat they'd shared, watching him pack a bag with the specific efficiency of someone who had thought through the packing order in advance. He'd said things, many things, the catalog of explanations and justifications that people produce when they've been caught and need to reorganize the narrative fast enough to land somewhere defensible. And she had listened to all of them in a silence that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't acceptance, and was really just the particular emptiness of a person whose brain has processed something but whose body hasn't yet caught up. He'd left. She'd stayed in the flat for 2 more months, which had been a mistake but a survivable one. Then she'd packed her own bag, more carefully because she'd had time to think about it, and come to London. She had not thought about running into him because he lived in Birmingham and had no reason to be in London, and the specific geography of their separation had been, until now, its own clean buffer. He was standing at the counter, ordering something, wearing the navy coat she recognized from 3 winters of looking at it. He turned, the way people turn when they feel someone's eyes on them, the old instinct, and he saw her. She had about 2 seconds to decide what to do, and she spent them badly by not doing anything, which meant that she was still standing there, coat half off, when he crossed the shop and said her name. Sophie. His voice was exactly the same. She'd forgotten that. How specific a person's voice is, how it bypasses the more careful parts of the brain and lands somewhere older. She felt nothing dramatic, just the slight shift of something that had been closed being opened briefly, against her preference. Lucas, she said. He looked the same. That was the thing about people who'd hurt you. They didn't have the decency to look different afterward. He was 32, good-looking in the easy, unearned way he'd always been, and he was looking at her with an expression that had been calibrated, she could see even now, to convey exactly the right amount of remorse. I didn't know you were in London, he said. I moved. A few months ago. I know. James told me. James, a mutual friend from Birmingham, the human equivalent of a junction on a road network. I tried to reach you. You didn't respond. I know, she said. Can we? He gestured at the nearest table. 10 minutes. Please. She should have said no. The clean, correct, self-preserving answer was no, said calmly and without drama, followed by her ordering her coffee and leaving. She knew this. She also knew that she was not, despite considerable effort over the past 8 months, completely finished with the thing that Lucas represented. Not with him, but with the unresolved math of it. The part she'd told Ethan about on that January evening, the question of how much had been real. She sat down. He sat across from her. He didn't touch her hands or perform the reaching gesture. She'd always hated that gesture, the one men did across tables when they wanted to appear sincerely remorseful. He just sat. And to his limited credit, he began with the one thing that might have mattered 8 months ago, but landed too late to fully count now. I'm sorry, he said. I was I was a coward. I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway, and I told myself stories about why it was okay, and none of them were true. I was selfish, and I hurt you, and I'm sorry. She looked at him, waited for the ambush of feeling that this kind of apology was supposed to produce, the softening, the reopening, the pull toward the simpler time before the specific wound. She felt almost nothing. Not nothing exactly. A low residual sadness, the way you feel about something that mattered but is genuinely over. And beneath it, something else. The thin, cold awareness that she was examining her own emotional reaction to this man and finding it surprisingly navigable, which was either growth or numbness, and she wasn't sure yet which. I know you're sorry, she said. I believe you. He leaned forward slightly. I want another chance, Sophie. I know I don't deserve it. I know what I'm asking, but I've spent 8 months thinking about what I threw away, and He stopped. I've changed. I know that's what people say. It is what people say, she agreed, but I mean it. She looked at him for a moment. At the familiar face, the familiar cadence of his speech, the particular way he'd always leaned forward when he was trying to persuade her of something. Where are you staying? She asked. He blinked, the question not what he'd expected. Shoreditch. I'm here for work for 2 weeks. Software contract. 2 weeks? She repeated. I wanted to see you. I came to London partly because of that. He said it with more honesty than strategy, which she recognized and gave him credit for, even now. I wanted to ask properly, face to face. She sat with it. The coffee she'd ordered arrived and she wrapped her hands around it, not from nerves, just warmth, and looked at the table surface for a moment. I don't know, she said finally. And that was the honest answer, which she also hated. Not no, because no would require certainty she hadn't yet assembled. Not yes, because that would require a trust she wasn't close to. Just the uncomfortable middle truth of a person who was further from the wound than she'd been, but not yet sure what the healed version looked like. Can I call you? He asked. While I'm here. She looked at him, made the kind of decision that she would turn over many times in the following weeks. The decision made not from wanting him back, but from not yet being sure enough of the absence of that wanting to be definitive about it. I'll text you, she said. Don't call. He nodded. Left when he said he would, without pressing, which was either maturity or tactical restraint, and she couldn't fully tell the difference. She sat in the coffee shop for 20 more minutes and drank her coffee and looked at the street outside and thought about the in-between stage of things, the part where everything is changing, but you can't see it. Lily's assessment, which had been, like most things, Lily said, more accurate than it had any right to be coming from a 5-year-old with a stuffed rabbit and strong opinions about cereal. She texted him 3 days later. Not a date, not a reconciliation, coffee, a walk, the kind of cautious, neutral contact that let her take the measure of the thing without committing to it. They met twice that first week. Lucas was different, maybe. Or better at appearing different. She couldn't yet tell which, and that inability to tell was its own information. What she didn't do was tell Ethan. There was nothing to tell, she reasoned. They weren't in a relationship. They had not said anything to each other that constituted a declaration. The warmth between them existed in the space of what had not been said. And in that space there was no obligation and no claim, and what she did with her personal life was her personal life. She was right about this. She knew she was right about this. She also knew that the reason she was rehearsing the argument to herself so carefully was that she felt, in some part of herself, she was reluctant to examine, like she was doing something that required the argument. The first sign that the situation was not contained came from James. She'd been at her desk on a Wednesday, working through a revision to the Hartley rollout collateral, when James appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision and sat on the corner of her desk in the way that meant he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. Okay, she said, without looking up. What? Nothing, he said, in the tone of someone who had something. She looked at him. He was picking at the edge of his notebook. Someone saw you in that coffee shop on Friday, the one on Jubilee Street. She went still. Someone. Dean, from accounts. He was there getting lunch. James looked at his notebook. He mentioned it to someone, in the way people mention things. In the way people... She stopped. James. I'm not saying anything, James said carefully. I'm just... You know how this building works. Everybody knows everybody's orbit. And when someone's orbit shifts slightly, people notice. My personal life is not. I know that. I'm just. Heads up. He finally looked at her directly. He seemed nice. The guy you were with. She looked at the screen in front of her, which had stopped being visible about 30 seconds ago. It's complicated, she said. Yeah, James said gently. I figured it might be. He left it there. Didn't press, didn't editorialize, went back to his own desk with the quiet tact of someone who had said what he came to say and respected the boundary after. She appreciated that about James, that he was decent in the specific, unpretentious way that didn't require acknowledgement, but the thing James had said sat with her for the rest of the afternoon. People notice. In a company this size, in a department where relationships and dynamics were everybody's ambient awareness, people noticed. And if people were noticing what was happening with Sophie, then the question of what was happening with Sophie and Ethan would also be part of the noticing, which meant it wasn't quite as contained as she'd been telling herself. She went home that evening and lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, which was the closest she had to a thinking space in a flat with thin walls and her flatmate's television, and she tried to be honest with herself about the full shape of the situation. She was seeing Lucas, not romantically, not yet, but with the specific ambiguity that not yet implied, which was itself a form of leaving the door open. She felt nothing for Lucas that she'd once felt, or at least nothing she could clearly locate, but she couldn't be certain that was permanent. She was something with regard to Ethan, something that didn't have a clean name but had a clear weight to it, something that had been building since November and had not shown any sign of decreasing, something that involved sitting in conference rooms and listening to him ask questions and knowing before the answer came what quality of thinking the answer would reveal, and something that involved watching him with Lily in the cafe, with both hands around his coffee cup, and something settling in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Two somethings, running parallel. Neither resolved. She was, she thought, an absolute mess. She laughed at herself in the dark, alone, which was at least evidence that the perspective was still operating. What she didn't know, and had no way of knowing, was that 3 floors and a considerable amount of professional distance away, Ethan had also heard something, not from Dean in accounts, but from a source considerably closer. Richard, who was not a gossip in the crude sense, but who was the kind of person who treated information about personnel dynamics as legitimately relevant business data, had mentioned at the end of a meeting that one of the creative team members had been seen meeting someone, a man. Twice, apparently. Richard had framed it as nothing, just thought you should know, given the steering committee access, which was one of the more transparent pieces of framing Ethan had encountered in some time. He'd acknowledged it with the flat neutrality he kept for situations where his actual reaction was not what he wanted to broadcast, and Richard had left. Ethan had sat at his desk for several minutes after. He had no claim. He was clear about that, rigidly, deliberately clear, in the way that clarity is deployed specifically because the feeling underneath it is pushing in the other direction. He had said nothing to her. He had made no move. He had offered lifts and attended meetings and bought Thai food for a steering committee and had not, at any point, done the thing that he had come close to doing several times without quite letting himself arrive at it. He had reasons. She'd told him about the person who'd hurt her, the calculated, sustained betrayal of someone who'd been given 2 years of her trust. The damage that kind of thing left, which he understood from a different angle, because what grief left behind and what betrayal left behind had different shapes but the same fundamental result. A person who needed to learn again whether the world was safe enough to step into. He hadn't wanted to be another force that complicated that relearning. He'd also, somewhere beneath the clean, principled reasons, been afraid. He hadn't wanted to be afraid. He was 32, had run a company for 4 years, had navigated loss and grief and the specific daily weight of single parenthood with Lily, and he did not consider himself a man who was generally governed by fear. But this particular fear, the fear of reaching for something real and being wrong about it, of reopening something he'd kept carefully closed since Clara, was real, and he'd let the principled reasons do the work of covering it. And now someone had walked back into her life, and he was sitting at his desk feeling the specific irrational ache of a man who has waited too long, which he had no right to, and which was present anyway. He picked up his phone, put it back down, picked up the acquisition brief he'd been working through and stared at it without reading it for 4 minutes. Then he went home to Lily. Lily was doing her homework at the kitchen table, a drawing project with felt-tip pens arranged in a precise row beside her paper in a way that was absolutely his organizational habit reflected in a 5-year-old. She looked up when he came in, assessed him with the unfiltered accuracy of a child who had been paying close attention to this particular adult for her entire conscious life. "You look tired," she said. "I had a long day." "Was it meetings?" "Some of it." "Meetings make you look like that," she said, returning to her drawing. "Like you're thinking about something that doesn't have an answer." He sat at the table across from her, loosened his tie, watched her work. The careful way she colored inside the lines, except when she decided the lines were wrong, and then crossed them without hesitation. "Lily," he said. "Hmm? Do you still think about Sophie?" She looked up, considered the question with the seriousness she gave things she actually thought about. "Yes," she said. "She knows the good names for things, like underrated." She turned back to her drawing. "And she listened to my whole frog thing. Most people only listen to the beginning." "Most people," he agreed. "You listen to the whole thing too," Lily said. "But that's your job." She paused. "Daddy." "Yes. If you like someone, you should probably just say so." She said it with the total casualness of someone stating an obvious thing without looking up from her coloring. "That's what we learned in school, about using our words." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. "It's not quite that simple," he said, "when you're a grown-up." Lily thought about this seriously. "Why?" He didn't have a good answer, which was, in itself, information. "Okay," he said. "Fair point." The following week, at the Thursday steering committee, Sophie walked in and sat down and opened her laptop and was, as she always was, completely professionally present, looking at the screen, pulling up the documents, asking James something quiet about the slide order. She didn't look different. She looked exactly the same. He looked at her for slightly longer than was necessary, and then looked at the briefing document in front of him and read the same paragraph 3 times. The meeting ran normally. She presented her section of the Hartley analysis with the same focused clarity she always brought to it. The specific intelligence that had been the first thing he'd recognized about her, before everything else, back when he'd thought he could keep the two things separate and clean. The room responded the way it always did. Richard made a comment that was 2/3 genuine engagement and 1/3 territorial, and she handled it the way she handled Richard, which was to answer the substantive part as though the territorial part hadn't been spoken. After, in the corridor, the same corridor where it had started, or where the professional version of it had started, he said her name. She turned. He'd been going to ask about the Hartley follow-up schedule. That had been the plan. A clean, professional question about timelines, the kind of thing that happened after steering committees, the kind of exchange that didn't require any additional honesty from either party. He said, "Are you okay?" She looked at him. "I heard—" He stopped. Decided to be honest about the shape of what he'd heard rather than the source. "I heard you've been seeing someone." The thing that happened to her face was brief and complicated. Not guilt. He registered that immediately, and it mattered. More like the expression of someone who had been hoping to navigate a difficult thing without having to name it, and who now saw that naming it was being required. "A few times," she said. "Someone from before, from Birmingham. The one who—" "Yes." He held her gaze, said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. "It's not— I don't know what it is," she said, and the honesty of it, the refusal to package it more neatly than it was what he'd come to recognize as her specific kind of courage. "I'm figuring something out, about where I am, what I'm actually done with and what I'm not." "That's fair," he said. His voice came out level. He was glad about that. "Ethan," she said his name with a weight in it that she hadn't used before. "I'm not doing anything dishonest. There's nothing between us that I'm not—" "I know," he said. "I just need to—" "Sophie." He said it quietly, firmly, not to stop her, but because the explanation was becoming more elaborate than the situation required, which meant it was costing her something. "You don't owe me an explanation." She stopped. The elaboration ran out. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. Then, carefully, "But if I did owe you one, would it matter?" It was the most direct thing either of them had said in 4 months of circumnavigating the direct thing, and it landed with the weight of that accumulated avoidance behind it. He looked at her. At the woman who had been shaking in the rain in November with everything she owned in a bag and hadn't let go of it once. Who had walked into his company and been right, consistently and without apology, about every important thing she'd put her mind to. Who'd sat in his kitchen with his daughter and talked about frogs and cereal and the underrated quality of ordinary things, and had laughed, that unguarded, undefended laugh, in a way that had stayed with him for 6 weeks and was still present when he thought about it. Yes, he said, it would matter. The words sat between them in the corridor, real and irretrievable. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression, the one she usually managed so carefully, had come undone slightly at the edges, the way it did when she was processing something real rather than performing the processing of something real. I need some time, she said finally, quietly. I know. I'm not stringing anything along. I just need to... Sophie. His voice was patient, and it cost him something to make it patient, which was the honest version of the situation. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded. A single small nod, the kind that meant received rather than resolved. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, and he watched her go, and he stood in the corridor with the briefing document still in his hand and the particular specific discomfort of a man who has said a true thing that cannot now be unsaid, which was uncomfortable and also, at some cellular level that didn't consult his preferences. A relief. He'd said it. Not everything, but enough. The weeks that followed were the worst kind of weeks, the kind where nothing decisive happens and everything is in suspension. Sophie saw Lucas twice more, and each time she came away with more data and less certainty, which was not the direction data was supposed to move. He was trying. She could see him trying. He was attentive and present and said the right things, and none of it quite landed the way it had once landed, which might have been because he'd changed, or might have been because something in her had shifted so far that the receiver was no longer tuned to his frequency. She didn't know. At work, the situation with Ethan was managed. They were professional. They were exactly as professional as they'd always been, which, in the context of what had been said in the corridor, felt both appropriate and faintly absurd. He didn't press. He had said he wouldn't, and he didn't. She found this quality in him, the ability to mean what he said without requiring acknowledgement of the meaning, both the most admirable and the most difficult thing about him, because it left her nowhere to redirect the feeling and no procedural defense against it. Priya noticed. Of course Priya noticed. You're different, Priya said, one afternoon in the 3rd week of February, with the directness that Sophie had come to both depend on and dread. I'm tired, Sophie said. You said that last time. You're not tired. You're thinking about 2 things simultaneously, and neither of them is work. Sophie turned to look at her. I'm not asking, Priya said, hands up. It's not my business. I'm just telling you what I observe, which is that you're doing a very good impression of a person who's fine, and it's costing you more than it used to. Sophie looked at her desk. At the Hartley document she'd been revising for 40 minutes and had made approximately 2 actual changes to. What would you do, Sophie said, if you had something from your past that you hadn't properly finished with, and something new that you hadn't properly started with, and you couldn't figure out which one was real and which one was just familiar? Priya was quiet for a moment. Actually quiet. Not the loaded quiet of someone preparing a sharp answer, but the genuine quiet of someone taking the question seriously. I'd ask myself which one scared me more, she said finally. Not which one was safer. Which one scared me more. Because the things that scare you are usually the things that actually matter. Sophie looked at her. That's either very wise or very dangerous advice, Sophie said. Probably both, Priya said, and turned back to her screen. The thing that broke the suspension, that ended the weeks of managed distance and careful professional normalcy, was not a conversation or a decision. It was Lily. It was a Thursday evening, late February, one of the steering committee evenings that ran past 7. The committee had been disbanded for 20 minutes, and Sophie was still at the conference table, finishing her notes, when her phone buzzed. She picked it up. A text from a number she didn't immediately recognize, and then did. Mrs. Holloway. Lily is asking for you. She had a bad dream and woke up and got herself turned around about it. She's fine, but she's got it in her head that she needs Sophie. I know it's very forward of me to reach out, but she's been very insistent. And you know what she's like when she's insistent. No obligation whatsoever. I just said I would ask. Sophie read it twice. She was aware of the exact nature of the line she was standing at. Lily wasn't in danger. She didn't need Sophie. She wanted Sophie, which was a different and more complicated category. Going to the Penthouse at 7:30 on a Thursday evening when she was in the middle of the most genuinely confused period of her emotional life was, by every reasonable measure, not a conservative choice. She was typing back, "I'm on my way," before she'd completed the thought. She gathered her bag, her coat, her laptop. She stopped at the door of the conference room. She stood there for a moment in the empty room with the city lit up outside the floor-to-ceiling windows and the last of the day's meetings stacked in her head and the text from Mrs. Holloway on her phone screen. She went. Ethan was in the kitchen when she arrived, still in his work shirt, sleeves pushed up, apparently in the middle of making tea, the kind of unconscious domestic task that people do when they're quietly worried and need something to do with their hands. He turned when he heard the elevator, and when he saw her in the doorway, there was a moment where neither of them spoke, and then he said, "She's in her room. She calmed down about 15 minutes ago, but she's still awake. I got Mrs. Holloway's text. She should have called me," he said. "I would have—" "Ethan." Sophie had already put her bag down, already had her coat off. "It's fine. I wanted to come." He looked at her for a beat too long, and then, "She's through there." Lily was in bed with 3 stuffed animals arranged in a protective barrier and Gerald at the center, as the clear general. Her eyes were open when Sophie came in, large and serious in the nightlight's glow, the particular look of a child who'd been frightened and was not quite finished being frightened but was managing it. "Sophie," she said. "Hey." Sophie sat on the edge of the bed. "I heard you had a rough night." "I had a dream about the frog," Lily said. This was apparently explanatory. "Which frog?" "The one from school, in the in-between stage. In my dream, it was stuck." She hugged Gerald. "It couldn't finish changing." Sophie looked at this small person who said true things in the language of 5-year-olds and felt something in her chest that was warm and specific and not at all ambiguous. "That sounds scary," she said. "It was." Lily looked at her with complete seriousness. "But you're here now." "I'm here. Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Yes," Sophie said. "I'll stay." She sat on the edge of the bed and Lily talked for a while in the drowsy, unfocused way of a child winding down from an adrenaline spike. Fragments about the frog, about something that happened at school, about Gerald's emotional state, which was apparently complex. Sophie answered when answers were required and was quiet when quiet was what was needed. 15 minutes later, Lily was asleep. Sophie sat for a moment after, in the dim room with the sleeping child and the nightlight and the assembled stuffed animals, the particular silence of a child's bedroom late at night, which was its own complete thing. She went back to the kitchen. Ethan was still there. Tea made, both cups on the counter. He pushed one toward her without a word, and she took it, and they stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island with their tea and the quiet of the sleeping apartment around them. "She's out," Sophie said. "Thank you for coming," he said. She looked at her cup. "She told me she had a dream about the frog, the one from her project. She said it was stuck in the in-between stage, couldn't finish changing." He was quiet. "I've been stuck," Sophie said. She said it carefully. Not as confession, not as announcement, just as the thing that was true, offered because this particular space, this particular kitchen, this particular man had become somewhere she could say true things and have them held carefully. "I've been trying to figure out which direction to finish changing in." "And?" His voice was very quiet. She looked up at him, at the face she'd been learning for 4 months across conference tables and steering committees and 2 late evenings in the back of a car. The face of a person who was not simple and not perfect, and who had his own history that he carried carefully and who had looked at her, consistently, like she was worth looking at. "I think I've been scared," she said, "of doing this wrong again." "So have I," he said. She absorbed that. The admission, the directness of it, the fact that he said it plainly without performance. "Lucas came back," she said. "To London." "I know. I saw him a few times." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You didn't ask." It wasn't my place to ask. His jaw was tight. She saw it, the contained quality of someone holding something carefully. I said I wasn't going anywhere. That meant staying in place while you worked out what you needed to work out, not checking in on it. She set her cup down. The kitchen was quiet. The city was quiet outside the windows. Lily was asleep. I don't have feelings for him, she said. I wanted to find out if I did. I needed to know if there was anything left there that mattered. There isn't. She said it without drama. Just the flat, certain voice of someone who had done the work and arrived at the answer. It's not him. It hasn't been him for a long time. I needed to be sure. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The way he did when he was processing something accurately rather than reactively. And now you're sure, he said. Yes. A pause. The particular pause of two people who have said the true things and are standing at the edge of what comes after the true things. Sophie. His phone rang. The sound was jarring, sudden in the quiet kitchen, and they both flinched slightly. The specific shared flinch of two people who'd been in the middle of something and had it interrupted. He pulled it out of his pocket, looked at the screen. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but the way expressions change when the professional layer reinsets itself over everything else. I have to take this, he said. It's New York. Take it, she said. He looked at her for a half-second longer, the kind of look that was making a note, filing something away for later. Then he picked up and turned toward the window, voice shifting into the measured cadence of a business call. She picked up her cup again, finished her tea, got her coat, her bag, wrote a note on the back of a receipt from her wallet, the only paper available, and left it on the kitchen counter. She fell asleep fine. Gerald was very reassuring. S. She left before he got off the call. Took the elevator down to the street where London sat in its late February cold, and walked to the tube. And on the way she felt, not resolved, not finished, but different from the suspended airless middle ground she'd been navigating for weeks. Something was coming to a conclusion. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing. Not the change itself yet, but the pressure shift that announces it. She was almost ready. She just needed one more thing to be honest about, and she was working her way toward it, and she suspected that when she got there, she wouldn't stop herself this time. The note was still on his kitchen counter when he got off the call. He'd been on with New York for 47 minutes, a restructuring issue with a subsidiary that had chosen 10:30 on a Thursday night to become urgent, as these things did, with the particular disregard for human timing that business crises specialized in. By the time he put the phone down, the apartment was fully quiet. Lily, long asleep. Mrs. Holloway, having left an hour earlier. He stood in the kitchen and read the note twice. She fell asleep fine. Gerald was very reassuring. S. The handwriting was quick and slightly slanted, the kind that happened when you wrote on whatever surface was available rather than a proper desk. He stood there with it between two fingers and felt the specific weight of what he'd almost said before the phone rang. What he'd been about to say. What he'd been standing 3 words away from saying and then hadn't. He put the note in the drawer beside the kitchen counter. Not thrown away. Filed. He went to check on Lily. She was flat on her back, one arm flung sideways, Gerald under her chin. The nightmare was clearly done with. She looked the way children look when they're genuinely, completely asleep. The particular boneless, unconditional surrender to unconsciousness that adults lose somewhere along the way and spend the rest of their lives trying to get back. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then went to bed. He did not sleep well. The following morning was a Friday, and Fridays at Sterling Global had a particular rhythm. The weekly all-team brief at 9, which Ethan ran himself and which was deliberately shorter than every other meeting in the building's calendar, designed to end before people's attention ran out. He was good at these. 15 minutes, clear priorities, room for questions, done. The kind of meeting that people left feeling like the time had been worth it, which was rarer than it should have been in corporate environments. He ran the brief on autopilot. The priorities were clear, the questions were answerable, the 15 minutes held. He was present and professional and completely functional, and also, beneath all of that, operating with the persistent low-grade preoccupation of a man who had been 3 words away from saying something and had not said it, and was now carrying the unsaid thing around like a stone in his shoe. He saw Sophie in the atrium afterward, brief, incidental, the crossing of paths that happened in a large open-plan building. She was with James, walking toward the coffee machine mid-conversation. She glanced up when she saw him. Something moved across her face. Awareness, acknowledgement, the particular expression of someone who was also carrying last night and had not yet figured out where to set it down. He gave her a small nod, she gave him one back, and they kept moving in their respective directions. Professional, clean, completely adequate. He went to his office and spent the morning on the things his morning was supposed to contain, and spent considerably more mental energy than he wanted to on the things it wasn't. The problem was that he'd let himself say yes, it would matter. He'd said it 3 weeks ago in the corridor and he'd meant it, and he didn't regret saying it, but it had changed the interior architecture of the situation in a way that couldn't be reversed. Before, the unnamed thing between them had existed in a comfortable ambiguity that allowed both of them to function. Now it had a shape. He'd given it a shape, with 4 words, and the shape was sitting in the room every time they were in a room together, and the difference between the before and after was not comfortable at all. He was not a man who generally suffered the consequences of his own honesty with much grace. He found this out again now. At 11:30, his assistant Claire put her head around the door. "Lucas Carter's in the lobby," she said. Ethan looked up from the document on his screen. "Who?" Claire checked her tablet. "He says he's a personal contact of Sophie Bennett's. He doesn't have an appointment. He's asking if she's available." The information arrived with a particular unwelcome clarity. Ethan looked at his screen for a moment, doing nothing visible. "Tell security to let him wait in the ground floor reception," he said. "Then let Sophie know she has a visitor." "Should I?" "That's all, Claire. Thank you." Claire left. He turned back to his document and read the same sentence 4 times, and then put the document down and looked at the window instead, which was more honest. Lucas Carter in the lobby. Coming to her office, which meant he'd looked up where she worked, which wasn't difficult. Sterling Global was not a secret, and Sophie's LinkedIn had been updated. It meant he was still in London, which his 2-week work contract apparently hadn't ended yet or had been extended. And it meant he was not, despite the quiet clarity Sophie had expressed in the kitchen last night. "I don't have feelings for him." Finished trying. Ethan thought about this with the measured objectivity he applied to most problems, and arrived at the conclusion that he was not measured or objective about this at all, which was information. He made himself go back to work. Downstairs, Sophie received the message from Claire with the expression of someone who had been expecting a simpler Friday. "He's in reception," James said from over her shoulder, having apparently received the information via the building's informal intelligence network approximately 30 seconds after Sophie did. "Ground floor." "I know," Sophie said. "Are you going down?" She looked at her screen. The Hartley final campaign document was open, cursor blinking in the middle of a sentence she'd been constructing for 6 minutes. She'd been focused this morning, focused with the specific, deliberate quality of someone using work as a tool for keeping other things at the right distance. "Yes," she said. She went down. Lucas was standing near the reception desk, coat on, looking slightly uncertain in the way people looked when they were in corporate lobbies they hadn't been invited to. The particular low-level exposure of being in someone else's professional territory. He saw her come through the security door, and some of the uncertainty resolved into something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. "I should have texted first," he said, before she could speak. "Yeah," she said. She kept her voice level. Not cold, just clear. "I know, I just—" He looked at her, and to his credit there was nothing strategic in it. Just the unshielded expression of a man who was genuinely, plainly, losing something he'd decided he wanted back. "I've been thinking about what you said, the last time we met, that you needed more time." "I did say that. I've been trying to give you that. But my contract ends Monday, and I go back to Birmingham, and I just—" He stopped. "I needed to see you before I left. I needed to ask again." She looked at him, at the familiar face that had been part of her life for 2 years, that had been present for things that mattered, that had also been present for the thing that had ended it. The specific, sustained dishonesty that she had replayed enough times to have memorized its shape. She looked for what she'd been looking for across their February meetings. The residual feeling, the pull, the version of wanting that would have told her the 8 months of distance hadn't resolved the thing but only deferred it. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something that resembled closely and without sentimentality the absence of something, not the charged absence of something recent and raw, the settled, completed absence of something genuinely finished, The difference between a wound and a scar. "Lucas," she said. She said it as gently as she could manage, which was genuinely gentle because she didn't want to hurt him and she didn't want to be cruel, and she also needed to be honest because she'd spent enough time in the past year being dishonest with herself and it had cost her considerably. "I've thought about it. I've genuinely, honestly thought about it, and I don't think what I need is what we had." He was very still. "What we had was real," she said. "Some of it. I know it was. And I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time and I'm not now. But the version of me that fit with the version of you, I don't think she's who I am anymore." She paused. "I think you coming back helped me figure that out. So in a strange way, I'm grateful for these weeks." He looked at the floor. The lobby sound moved around them. The quiet professional hum of a large building, someone's heels on the marble, a phone ringing at the desk. When he looked back up, his expression had shifted from the uncertainty of before into something more honest and more painful. "Is there someone else?" he asked. She held his gaze. "I don't know yet," she said, "but that's not the reason. The reason is what I just said." He nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that meant he'd heard her and was working through what he'd heard rather than just performing the acceptance of it. "Okay," he said finally. "Take care of yourself," she said, and meant it. "You too." He looked at her once more, the long, careful look of someone committing something to memory. "For what it's worth, you seem different, in a good way, better than the last time I saw you in Birmingham." "I am," she said. "Better." He left. She stood in the lobby for a moment after the door closed and did a quiet inventory. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even. She felt sad in the small, specific way that endings carried even when they were the correct ending. Not grief, just the particular weight of a chapter closing that had been open for a long time. She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk and finished the sentence that had been waiting for her in the Hartley document and worked through the rest of the morning with the focused, forward-facing clarity of someone who had put something down and had both hands free. She didn't go to Ethan's office. She thought about it. The pull was there, immediate and clear. But she sat with it and decided it was not the right moment, not the right way. She'd said what she needed to say last night in his kitchen, or close to it. The rest needed a different space and a different kind of deliberateness. Not a corridor, not a brief window between someone finishing a call. Something intentional. She owed them both that. The weekend passed the way weekends passed when you're waiting for something, too slowly and with too much quiet. She worked on Saturday morning, took a long walk along the river Saturday afternoon in the kind of gray-cold February weather that was somehow easier to be in than the indoor version of the same gray-cold, and spent Sunday doing the domestic accounting of her life. Groceries, laundry, a long overdue call to her mother in Birmingham that she'd been putting off because her mother had a particular frequency for detecting emotional turbulence in Sophie's voice, and then asking about it in ways that were both accurate and exhausting. Her mother, true to form, detected it in approximately 4 minutes. "You sound different," her mother said, from Birmingham, over the particular slightly delayed satellite quality of a long mobile call. "I'm fine," Sophie said. "Different isn't bad. I didn't say bad. I said different." A pause. "Is it the job?" "The job is good." "Is it a man?" Sophie looked at her laundry. "Mum." "I'll take that as a yes." Her mother had the particular unapologetic accuracy of a woman who had raised Sophie alone from the age of 9 and had developed the kind of perceptiveness that came from being the only adult in a household and needing to know everything. "Is he good?" Sophie thought about that, about the note she'd left on the counter, about the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen before the phone rang, about, yes, it would matter, said quietly in a corridor 4 months into knowing each other with the complete unperformative honesty that was the thing she'd identified earliest in him and trusted most. "Yeah," she said. "I think he is." Her mother made a small, satisfied sound. "Good. You deserve someone good. Don't make it a thing." "I'm not making it a thing. I'm stating a fact. You can state facts without it being a thing." Sophie finished the laundry call and sat on her bed and looked at the wall and thought about the fact that she was 30 years old and still needed her mother to say, "You deserve someone good," in order to register it as potentially true. She was working on it. Monday arrived, and with it the final week of February, which the London weather marked with a return to actual rain. Not the mild gray drizzle that had characterized the past few weeks, but the heavier, colder kind that came in off the Atlantic and moved through the city with a purpose. Sophie arrived at Sterling Global at 8:40, 5 minutes later than her first day, 8:45, which she took as evidence of growth, and went to her desk and opened her laptop and began the week. She did not see Ethan that morning. The executive floor was in a cycle of restructuring meetings that had been ongoing since the New York call on Thursday night, and the brief at 9 had been delegated to the senior management layer below him, which happened occasionally when his calendar reached a specific density. She got this information from Claire, who she'd started to develop a functional professional relationship with over the past few months. Not friendship exactly, but the particular mutual respect of two organized people who communicated efficiently. The information was delivered without commentary and received without it. She was fine. She was at her desk, doing her work. At the company, she'd built something real at over 4 months, and she was fine. She was also aware, with a precision that she'd stopped trying to argue with, that the building felt different when he wasn't in it. Larger and slightly less organized, in some qualities she couldn't name but was present. She was not pleased about this awareness. She noted it as data and continued working. The restructuring meetings apparently ran through lunch and into the afternoon. By 3 o'clock, she'd completed the Hartley final document, sent it to Diana, received Diana's single-sentence acknowledgement, solid work, which was Diana's equivalent of a standing ovation, and was working through the briefing materials for the next account in the pipeline. Her phone buzzed at 3:40. Not a call. A text from Ethan. The note is still on my counter. I should have said last Thursday what I'd been meaning to say for about 3 months. I'm sorry I didn't. Are you free Thursday evening? She read it twice, then a third time, because the third time was when it fully landed. She looked at it for about 20 seconds. The particular undefended directness of it. No preamble, no professional buffer. Just the thing, said plainly, with the specific courage of someone who'd decided that the cost of not saying it was higher than the cost of saying it wrong. She typed back, Thursday is fine, and for what it's worth, I should have said it too. She put the phone face down on her desk and looked at her screen and smiled. The real kind. The unmanaged kind. James, from 2 desks over, looked up at the precise wrong moment, saw the expression, looked back at his screen immediately with the practiced diplomacy of someone who had learned when not to comment. Thursday felt very far away. It was objectively 3 days. They were long days. Not because anything was wrong. The work was good. The meetings ran normally. The Hartley account was progressing with the momentum that came from several months of solid foundational work. She and Ethan were professional in the ways they'd always been professional, which now carried a different subtext but the same surface, and the surface was sufficient for the building around them. But underneath it, the 3 days had the quality of held breath. Wednesday afternoon, Priya looked at her for a long moment and said, Something's resolved. Work-related, Sophie said. Priya's tone was the specific tone of someone who believed this approximately 40%. Good. You were making me anxious. I was making you anxious? You're very load-bearing in this department. When you're off balance, the whole floor feels slightly tilted. Priya said this with the directness she applied to everything, which Sophie had come to recognize as one of the specific things she valued about this person. I'm glad you're upright again. Sophie looked at her. That's either a compliment or a warning. Both, Priya said. As usual. Thursday arrived. It arrived with the rain it had been threatening all week. The proper kind, heavy and insistent, running in thick rivulets down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 28th floor conference room where the Hartley final review was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Sophie presented the last section of the brand rollout with the confidence of someone who had spent 4 months building toward this specific moment, and when she finished, the account director said, I think we're done, in the tone that meant they were done and it was good, and the room filed out with the particular lightness of a team that had completed a thing properly. She was packing her laptop when Ethan said, from across the table, 7 o'clock. She looked up. I'll send Marcus for you, he said. Unless you'd rather... 7 is fine, she said. The address... I know the address. Something that might have been amusement moved across his face. She zipped up her laptop bag and left before she said something that belonged to the evening rather than the conference room. She went back to her desk and finished the afternoon, and at 5:30 she went home and changed. Not into anything dramatic, just clean clothes, the dark blue shirt she'd bought herself 2 weeks ago because she'd wanted it and it fit properly. And she was still adjusting to the idea of buying things she wanted because she wanted them rather than because they were necessary. She stood in the small bathroom of her rented flat and looked at her reflection for a moment. Her mother had said you deserve someone good. She looked at herself. The same face she'd been looking at for 30 years, the same features that had been through the same things she'd been through, and made herself believe it. Not perform the belief, actually do it. She took the tube to Chelsea. Marcus was waiting where he always waited, the discreet, precisely parked Mercedes at the curb, but she didn't need him because the tube let her out 3 minutes from the building, and the walk was fine even in the rain because she had the right coat now, the one she'd bought in January to replace the November disaster. The lobby, the elevator, the key fob she'd been given months ago for the steering committee meetings that ran late and had never quite felt like a professional tool since the first time she'd used it. The door opened before she knocked. He was in the hallway, still in his work shirt but jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The particular end-of-day version of him that she'd learned over the past months, the one that appeared after the last call and before the transition into the evening. He looked at her in the doorway with the reins still on her coat shoulders, and he said nothing for a moment, which was him doing the thing he did where he took a situation inaccurately before responding to it. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said, and stepped back to let her in. The apartment was quiet in the way it was when Lily was elsewhere. She'd registered this before Ethan confirmed it. Mrs. Holloway took Lily for a sleepover at her sister's. She does that once a month. Lily loves it because there's a dog. What kind of dog? Some variety of spaniel. Lily calls it Biscuit, which is not its name. Mrs. Holloway's sister doesn't correct her. Sophie smiled, hanging up her coat. Of course she doesn't. The kitchen was the same kitchen it always was. The one where she'd had breakfast the morning after the rain, where she'd sat with Lily and talked about frogs, where she'd drunk tea on Thursday night and left a note and gone. She sat at the island, the same stool she'd used the first morning, and he made tea without asking because he knew by now that she wanted it, and this small, domestic, completely unremarkable act of being known in that ordinary way hit her in a place that she hadn't braced for. He set the cup down in front of her and sat on the other side of the island. They looked at each other. I've been trying to do this correctly, he said. I have a list of reasons why the timing was wrong, why I shouldn't have, why it was complicated. They're not bad reasons. I know, she said, but I've been using correct reasons to avoid doing something I should have done months ago. So have I. He looked at his own cup, the small, contained quality that was his default, the held stillness of a man who had learned that most things could be managed if you held still long enough and thought carefully enough. She'd spent months reading him, and she could see now what the stillness was covering, which was not the absence of feeling, but the opposite. The night in November, he said, I made a decision in about 4 seconds, to stop the car. I've made faster business decisions with worse information, but that one, he stopped. I didn't know what it was then. I thought it was just doing what anyone decent would do. And now, she said, now I think it was the first time in 4 years that I'd done something entirely on instinct without thinking through the consequences first. He looked at her. And the consequence was you. The words sat in the kitchen between them, plain and specific. She'd been preparing, on the tube over, for this conversation, or not preparing exactly, but thinking about what she wanted to say and how to say it without either the elaborate caution of the past 4 months or the overcorrection in the other direction. She'd thought about starting with the Lucas situation, with the explanation of where she'd landed, with the responsible summary of how she'd arrived here. She said none of that. I left the note because I didn't know how to stay, she said. After you took the call, I would have stayed. I wanted to. But I didn't know yet if I had the right to want that, and so I left instead. And I've been trying to figure out the answer to that question since November. And? I think I've been asking the wrong question, she said. The right question isn't whether I have the right to want it, it's whether I actually want it. She held his gaze. And I do. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Ethan Sterling didn't do dramatic. but something that had been held very carefully for a very long time let go, and the difference in his expression before and after was the difference between a closed room and an open one. "Lucas came to the office last Friday," she said. "I talked to him in the lobby." "I know." "He asked me again. I said no. I said no because what I told you in the kitchen on Thursday night was true. It's not him. It hasn't been him. I needed to be sure, and now I'm sure." "Did you tell him that?" "Yes, as honestly as I could." She looked at her cup. "He asked if there was someone else." "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know yet." She looked back up. "That was Thursday. It's Monday now. I know more than I did." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't handle the weeks after correctly," he said. "After the corridor, after I said what I said. I pulled back. Professionally correctly, but I pulled back, and I think it looked like you regretted saying it," she said. "Yes." "Did you?" "No," he said. "I regretted not saying more." She absorbed that. "I need you to know something," he said. "I'm not—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing words with the care he gave to things that mattered. "I'm not an easy situation. I have a company and a daughter and a history that I've mostly made peace with, but that is still a part of what I am. I'm not going to pretend that's simple." "I know," she said. "I have a history too. I know you do. And I'm not pretending any of this is simple." She looked at him directly. "But I've spent 8 months avoiding things that weren't simple, and all it got me was a pavement in Notting Hill and a very wet coat." He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened that she'd only seen a few times. The real version of his expression, unpretending, undirected at anything except her. "The coat is better now," he said. "Much better," she agreed. He stood up from his side of the island. She didn't move. She held very still with her cup of tea and watched him come around to her side, and when he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the detail of him that she'd been not looking at for 4 months, she set the cup down. "Sophie," he said. "Yes," she said. Not as a question, not as agreement to a specific proposal. Just yes. Yes to the thing he was about to say, to the thing that had been building since November, to the terrifying and specific reality of a person who had been hurt before deciding to try again with their eyes open because the alternative was staying closed, and she'd tried that, and it wasn't any less painful in the long run. He put one hand against her jaw, careful, unhurried, the quality of someone who had thought about this and was present in the thinking of it, and kissed her. It was not a movie kiss. She'd had movie kisses. The practiced, performed ones that looked right from the outside and felt hollow in the middle. This was not that. This was the specific, uncertain, real kind that came from two people who had spent 4 months being careful and were now not being careful, with all the attendant awkwardness and weight and strange, undefended warmth of a thing that was true rather than arranged. She kissed him back, put one hand against his chest, and felt him exhale slightly, the held-tight quality of him releasing by degrees, and something in her own chest that had been braced for a very long time went quiet. After a moment, or several moments, she didn't track it, he pulled back far enough to look at her. "Okay," he said. He said it like it was the first clear word after a long sentence. "Okay," she said back. They stood in his kitchen with the rain going on outside and the city doing what it always did, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was the right choice. The silence had the quality of something settled rather than something waiting to be filled. Then she said, because it was true, and because she was practicing saying true things, "I was afraid." "I know," he said, "of doing this wrong again." "I know." His hand was still at her jaw, his thumb tracing the faint scar from the cut above her eyebrow, the one Mrs. Holloway had cleaned on a November night, already faded to nearly nothing. "I was afraid too." "You didn't show it." "I showed it to Lily," he said. "She told me I should use my words." Sophie laughed. The real kind, the unmanaged kind, the one that had appeared in the cafe 5 weeks ago and he'd been thinking about since. She laughed, and he watched her do it with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. They made dinner. Not anything dramatic, there was pasta and the particular kind of improvised sauce that happened when two people opened a refrigerator together and made decisions based on what was available rather than what was planned. The kitchen was louder with two people moving in it. He managed the stovetop with the efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for himself and a small child for 4 years. She found the cheese and forgot where she'd put the grater, and found it behind the kettle, where it had no business being. "Why is the grater behind the kettle?" she asked. "Lily," he said without turning around from the stove. "How?" "I've stopped asking." She grated the cheese. They ate at the kitchen island on the same stools they'd used in the morning after the rain, 4 months ago, which she didn't mention because it didn't need mentioning. It was already in the room, part of the accumulated texture of the thing they'd been building without fully naming it. He told her about Lily's current phase, which involved a firm conviction that the spaniel at Mrs. Holloway's sister's house should be rehomed with them, a campaign being conducted through a combination of persistent verbal requests and strategic placement of dog-related drawings on Ethan's desk. "She's been putting them in the briefing documents," he said. Sophie stared at him. The Harrington Quarterly Report had a drawing of a spaniel on page 7. He said it with the flat, exhausted tone of a man who had found this and had experienced multiple simultaneous emotions about it. "Claire found it before it went to the printer." "What did you do?" "I kept it." He paused. "It's in my desk drawer. Don't tell her or it'll escalate." Sophie looked at him. At this man. Serious, controlled, running a company with the precise efficiency of someone who had built it from the serious and controlled application of exceptional intelligence, who kept his daughter's drawings of lobbied-for dogs in his desk drawer and had made a note about a biscuit left on a kitchen counter 4 months ago. "You're a good dad," she said. He looked at her. "I'm trying." "No," she said. "You're not trying, you're doing it. There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression. The same quality she'd seen when she'd said, "You seem better." The quality of a thing landing close and being received rather than deflected. "Thank you," he said quietly. The rain was still going. Outside the penthouse windows, London sat in its wet February dark, the familiar skyline smeared with wet light, the river somewhere beyond it doing its slow, indifferent thing. She'd looked at this city from the pavement up, from a wet side street in November, and it had been enormous and cold and full of the specific hostility of a place that didn't know you. She looked at it now from the 32nd floor, warm, with food and tea and the smell of someone's cooking still in the air, and it looked different, not smaller, not tamed, just navigable. She was aware, sitting in this kitchen with this man, that nothing was resolved in the clean and final way that things resolved in stories. She had a small rented room with thin walls and a flatmate she barely knew. She had 4 months at a job that was good but early. She had a history that was finished but not forgotten, which was how histories worked. You didn't stop having them, you just stopped letting them make all the decisions. And she had this. Whatever this was, at the start of it, with all the uncertainty that starting things carried. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, the most she'd had in as long as she could accurately remember, and she was old enough to know that was not nothing. He refilled her tea without being asked. She looked at the cup and then at him. "I should probably tell you something," she said. He waited. "The first morning, after the rain, when I told you I was fine." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I wasn't fine. I was about 12 hours from completely running out of money. My phone was about to lose service because I hadn't paid the bill. And I'd been sleeping in a hostel dorm for a week that was costing almost everything I had left." She looked at him. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to be more of a situation than I already was." He was quiet for a moment. "The hostel," he said. Not a question. Running it back, recalibrating the full picture of that night with the new information. "Yes." "After you left here," he said carefully. "In the cab I called. I went back to it, yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She waited for the pity, the particular patronizing softening that this kind of disclosure sometimes produced that made her feel smaller than the facts. It didn't come. "You were 24 hours from an interview that would change everything," he said, "and you still came in on Monday with that framework." "I needed the job," she said, badly enough that being impressive wasn't optional. He was quiet for a moment more, and then something in his expression resolved into something that was not pity and not admiration exactly. more like recognition. The way you looked at someone when you'd understood them incompletely and the complete version had just arrived. "The bag," he said, "in the rain. You never let go of it. Everything I had was in it." "I know," he said. "I think I knew then. I just didn't know how completely." She looked at him, at the man who had stopped a car on a side street in the rain because it was what any decent person would do and hadn't asked for an explanation, who had made cereal in the morning and called a cab and said you got it on your own and meant it, who had said yes, it would matter in a corridor at 7 p.m. with his briefing document still in his hand. "The first morning," she said. "When I left. I almost didn't." He looked at her. "Leave," she said. "I almost didn't leave. I stood in the hallway with my bag and I thought," she stopped. "I thought, this is somewhere I could stay. Not because it was luxurious or comfortable or any of those things, because it felt," she searched for the word that wasn't sentimental and wasn't insufficient. "Safe," she said, in a specific way, not just physically. He set down his cup. He reached across the island, not dramatically, not the practiced reach she'd always disliked. Just his hand, flat on the counter between them. She put her hand over it. "You can stay," he said. "Tonight, if you want. The guest suite is yours. No strings, same as the first time. Just, you don't have to go back to, The walls are actually fine," she said. "I've got used to them." "Sophie." "I know." She squeezed his hand once. "I know." She looked at him, this man who was asking her to stay in the careful, specific language of someone who understood what they were asking. "Ask me again in a month." He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved. The controlled, almost smile she'd catalogued over 4 months of conference tables and corridors. "A month?" he said. "Give or take." "Okay." She stayed until 11. They talked. About the company, about Lily's dog campaigns and its likely outcome, about Birmingham and the specific texture of growing up somewhere that was not designed for the ambitions you had, about Clara in the careful, honest way he'd begun to talk about her. Not often, not with the preserved grief of someone who hadn't moved, but with the settled love of someone who had carried something and learned to carry it without it being the only thing they were carrying. When Marcus came at 11, she got her coat. He walked her to the elevator, both of them standing at the door for a moment with the quiet of a building where a child was asleep and the rain had finally, after weeks, begun to ease. He kissed her again at the elevator, shorter this time. Just the thing itself, said plainly, without the weight of 4 months of not saying it behind it. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. She got in the elevator. The doors closed. She rode down through the quiet floors of the building where she worked, where she'd built something real over the past 4 months, past the 24th floor where her desk was, past the lobby where she'd signed new hire paperwork on a Monday morning with a pen she'd brought herself. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street was wet and reflective and cold, and London sat around her in its enormous and different way, and she walked to the tube feeling the particular, undefended warmth of someone who had been honest about what they wanted and had not been wrong to want it. She was not done being afraid. She suspected she would be afraid again, at intervals, for reasons she couldn't predict. That was the nature of starting things when you'd been hurt. The fear didn't disappear, it just stopped being the primary thing. Something else became the primary thing instead. She went home, made tea in the small kitchen she shared with flatmates she barely saw, sat on the edge of her bed in the room with the thin walls and the unreliable heating and looked at the wall for a moment, doing the honest accounting of the evening. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "The grater is still behind the kettle. I have no explanation." She smiled. Typed back, "I think Lily put it there on purpose. She's running experiments." A pause. Then, "That's exactly what she's doing. I'm going to pretend I don't see it. That's probably right. Good night, Sophie." She set the phone on the nightstand, turned off the light, lay in the dark with the thin walls and the sound of the city outside, and the particular, settling quiet of a person who had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop long enough to let something good simply be good. Outside, London went on. Somewhere across it, on the 32nd floor, a man sat at his kitchen counter for a moment before going to bed and took a note out of a drawer and read it once and put it back. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. March came in quietly. Not the dramatic seasonal shift that people talked about, spring arriving like an announcement, winter conceding with grace. It was London, so what actually happened was that the rain got slightly warmer, and the days got slightly longer, and there were occasional mornings where the light came through at an angle that suggested something different was possible, even if the temperature wasn't ready to commit to it yet. Small evidence. Enough. Sophie noticed it on the Tuesday of the first week of March, walking from the Tube to Sterling Global at 8:40 in the morning, the city doing its morning thing around her. The coffee shops opening, the delivery cyclists threading through traffic, the particular smell of a city waking up that was diesel and bakery and damp pavement in a combination that had, somewhere in the past 4 months, stopped feeling alien and started feeling familiar. She noticed the light, and she thought, okay, that's something. She was, by March, no longer new. That was the thing about belonging somewhere. It didn't arrive as an event. It accumulated. A month of knowing where the good coffee was and which elevator opened slowest. A month of being the person other people asked things, rather than the person asking. A month of walking into a building and having the security desk wave you through without checking the badge because they'd seen you enough times that the checking had become unnecessary. Small accumulations. The weight of them adding up to something you could stand on. She and Ethan had, in the month since the Thursday kitchen conversation, been building something with the careful, unhurried attention of two people who understood what careless building had cost them separately and were not interested in repeating the lesson. They had dinner twice a week, usually, Thursdays, which had been their day since the steering committee without either of them deciding it, and Sundays, which were quieter and involved Lily and whatever elaborate project Lily had in progress, which in March was a sustained and impressively researched campaign to adopt the Spaniel, now expanded to include a folder of printed articles about the emotional benefits of pet ownership for children, which Lily had asked Ethan's assistant Claire to print for her, and which Claire had done without comment. She went to Claire, Ethan said, on a Sunday, looking at the folder with the expression of a man confronting a superior strategic mind in a 5-year-old's body. She bypassed me entirely. She knew you'd intercept it, Sophie said, from the kitchen island, where she was cutting fruit with the particular ease of someone who had been in this kitchen enough times that it no longer required conscious navigation. Claire doesn't have a vested interest in the outcome. Claire printed 12 pages of research for a 5-year-old's dog campaign. Claire is a professional. Sophie set a piece of apple on the counter toward him. Also, Lily's argument is genuinely well structured. I read the folder. Ethan looked at her. You read the folder. It's thorough. She addresses the time commitment objection on page 4. He picked up the apple slice and ate it and looked at the folder and said nothing for a moment. Then, we're getting a dog, aren't we? Almost certainly, Sophie said. Okay, he said, with the specific resignation of someone who had already known the answer and was only now making peace with it. Okay. Lily, who had been in the living room with Gerald and had apparently been monitoring the kitchen conversation with the attention of someone who understood the value of strategic listening, appeared in the doorway at precisely this moment. Are we getting biscuit? She said. We're having a conversation, Ethan said. That's a yes, Lily said to Sophie. That's a maybe, Sophie said, with conditions. What conditions? To be determined, Sophie said, by your dad. Lily looked at her father with the complete weaponized focus of a child who had been preparing for this negotiation for 6 weeks and was ready for any counteroffer. Ethan looked at Sophie over Lily's head with the expression of a man who had just understood that the domestic balance of power in his household had shifted in a direction he hadn't fully anticipated and was not entirely displeased about. This was what they were building, not the dramatic version. Not the romance novel version where everything resolved into declarations and grand gestures and the music swelled. This was the actual version. Fruit on the counter and a dog campaign folder and a 5-year-old who had started coming to Sophie for tactical support, and a man who had learned to say okay to things he hadn't planned because the person suggesting them had earned his trust in a specific demonstrated way that planning couldn't replicate. It was, Sophie thought, the best thing she'd ever been part of building. And she'd built some good things. At Sterling Global, March brought the Hartley campaign launch. The brand rollout that had been in development since Sophie's second week at the company, the one that had started with a framework she'd built on a weekend because the brief had been wrong, and she'd known it was wrong, went live across 4 European markets on the 14th of March, with the particular combination of controlled chaos and careful execution that large campaign launches produced. Sophie was in the operations room when the first day numbers came in. She was sitting between James and Priya, all three of them with laptops and cold coffee, and the specific tense energy of people waiting to find out whether months of work had landed. The screens showed the real-time analytics feeds, engagement, click-through, the early sentiment signals that told you in the first hours whether you'd gotten the tone right. They'd gotten it right. The numbers moved in the right direction from the first hour and kept moving. By 3 in the afternoon, the account director was on the phone with the Hartley Group's European head, who had questions that were the good kind, the kind that came from wanting to understand something that was working rather than fix something that wasn't. By 5 o'clock, Ethan had sent a company-wide message that was characteristically short. 2 sentences acknowledging the launch and the team behind it, no hyperbole, no corporate performance, and Sophie had read it at her desk and felt the particular grounded satisfaction of work that had gone where it was aimed. Priya appeared at her desk at 5:15 with 2 cups of coffee, the decent kind, from the ground floor cafe rather than the machine, and set one in front of Sophie without ceremony. "Your framework," Priya said, "from November. That's what this was built on." "It was a team campaign," Sophie said. "Don't do that." Priya sat on the corner of the desk. "Don't minimize it. The positioning was yours. The consumer insight was yours. The rest of us built on top of it." She picked up her own cup. "Take credit for your work. It's a skill like any other, and you need to practice it." Sophie looked at her. Priya had been, over 5 months, the specific kind of colleague that Sophie had not expected to find. Not a friend in the way that word implied ease and history, but something functionally important. The kind of person who told you the truth about your blind spots without cruelty and expected the same in return. "Thank you," Sophie said, "for the coffee and the lecture." "The lecture was free," Priya said. "The coffee was £1.80 and I'm expensing it." Sophie smiled, drank the coffee, looked at the screen where the Hartley numbers were still moving in the right direction. She thought about the woman who had sat in this building's lobby in November, filling out new hire paperwork with her own pen because the desk pen had run out of ink, wearing a green blazer that was clean but not new, holding herself with the particular upright determination of someone who was terrified and was not going to let the terror be visible. That woman had walked into this building with everything she owned in a duffel bag at a hostel 2 miles away and an interview that she needed to not just pass but win, and she'd won it on the strength of work that was genuinely good because that was all she had. She was still that woman. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She hadn't become someone else. The circumstances had changed. The ground was more stable. The coat was better. But the person underneath was the same person who'd been making things work out of not enough for most of her adult life. And that person deserved some credit for still being here and still being good at this. She gave herself the credit. It felt like practice, like Priya said, but it felt like the right kind. Ethan found her in the operations room at 6, when most of the team had cleared out to go celebrate at the pub 2 streets over. The informal, loud, beer and relief version of a launch party that happened spontaneously at the end of successful campaign days. He stood in the doorway, jacket on, the end-of-day version of him that she knew well now, and said, "You're not at the pub." "I was finishing the day 1 summary," she said, "for the client report." "That can wait until tomorrow." "I know. I wanted to finish it." He looked at her for a moment, the particular look she'd come to recognize as him seeing her accurately rather than seeing what he expected to see. "Come get dinner," he said. "Not the pub. Somewhere quiet." "Lily, Mrs. Holloway, she's staying late." Sophie looked at the screen. The summary was 90% done. She saved it, closed the laptop. "Okay," she said. They went to a small Italian place near the river. Not expensive, not designed to impress, just good and warm, and the kind of place where the tables were close enough together that the conversations of other people became a comfortable ambient noise. They ordered wine, which Sophie drank slowly, because wine on an almost empty day of sustained adrenaline required attention, and pasta, and talked about the launch and then about things that weren't the launch because the launch was done, and tomorrow was for analyzing it. He told her about the acquisition that had been running since January, a smaller creative agency that Sterling Global had been in conversation with, which he'd been careful not to mention at work because the conversations were confidential and the outcome uncertain. It had closed that afternoon, he said, which was part of why his day had been in parallel with hers. 2 things, finishing simultaneously on the same March afternoon. What kind of agency? She asked. Brand and digital. They're good, particularly strong in the southern European markets, which is exactly where we've been thin. He turned his wine glass on the table, the habit of a man thinking while his hands found something to do. I want to integrate them carefully, not swallow them. The work is good because of how they operate, and changing how they operate to match Sterling's model would defeat the purpose. You're going to let them stay distinct, she said, as much as possible. Yes. She looked at him, at the man who ran a company with the precise, exacting intelligence that had built it and kept it exceptional, and who was also the man who kept a child's drawing of a lobbied-for dog in his desk drawer and had learned over 4 years of solo parenthood when to control things and when to leave them alone to be what they were. You're good at this, she said. He looked up. At what? Knowing what to hold tightly and what to let be. She meant the company. She also meant the other things. And they both knew she meant both. He held her gaze for a moment. I'm learning, he said, later than I should have. But learning. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not dramatically. Just the thing itself. The simple physical fact of contact that still, after a month of it, carried the slight electricity of something chosen rather than assumed. Same, she said. They walked back along the river afterward, the Thames doing its gray-brown, tidal, enormous thing beside them, the lights of the bridges reflecting on the water, London moving around them in its evening mode. She was in the coat she'd bought in January, the good one, and the cold was the kind of cold that was present but manageable, the March version that knew it was losing ground to something warmer. He took her hand at some point on the walk, without comment, without ceremony. She let him, without comment, without ceremony. They walked like that for 20 minutes, two people who had been through enough to know that the uncomplicated moments were the ones you held on to and held on. The month that followed was not uncomplicated. She'd been too experienced with the real version of life to expect uncomplicated. The complications came in the ordinary shapes, a week where the post-launch pressure on the creative team hit a density that made everyone irritable, and the office ran on bad coffee and shorter tempers. And Sophie made a call on a client communication that Diana disagreed with in a way that was pointed and needed to be worked through directly rather than around. They worked through it. Diana was difficult and correct about half of it, and Sophie was correct about the other half. And they reached something functional through the specific friction of two people who were both capable and neither of whom was going to concede something they believed in just to smooth the air. There was a week where Lily was sick. Nothing serious, the standard childhood respiratory thing that cycled through school classes in early spring. And Ethan was running on 4 hours of sleep per night between the early calls to the acquired agency in Barcelona and a daughter who woke at 2 a.m. needing water and the specific comfort of a parent being physically present. Sophie came over on the Wednesday of that week with soup she'd made in her small kitchen. The actual kind, the kind that took 2 hours and produced a mess she'd cleaned up before bringing it over. And Ethan had looked at it and then at her with the expression of a man who was too tired to hide anything. You made this, he said. It's just soup, she said. Sophie. Sit down, she said. You look terrible. I know, he said. He sat down. He ate the soup. He said, halfway through, I don't know what I did to deserve this week. Bad luck, she said. Sick kids and Barcelona conference calls are just bad luck. It's not a judgment. I know, he said. It just... He stopped, rubbed his face with one hand. Some weeks I feel like I'm barely holding it together, and I'm supposed to. I'm supposed to have this handled. The company, Lily, everything. She looked at him across the kitchen island, at the controlled, capable, perpetually measured man who was, in the unglamorous reality of a Wednesday evening with a sick child and inadequate sleep, just a person who was tired and trying. You don't have to have it all handled, she said. That's not what handled means. Then what does it mean? She thought about it. Continuing, she said. That's all. Just continuing. Showing up the next day. Making the soup or letting someone bring you soup. Doing the next thing. She looked at him. You've been doing that for 4 years. Alone. That's not barely holding together. That's holding together. He was quiet for a moment. You're good at this, he said. At saying the true thing. I've had to practice, she said. I spent a long time not doing it. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, at that moment, pale, slightly glassy, one hand holding Gerald by the ear with the grip of someone whose stuffed animal was performing essential structural support. "Sophie," she said, with the specific registered satisfaction of a sick child locating a preferred person. "Hey, you." Sophie was off the stool before she'd thought about it. She crossed the kitchen and crouched down to Lily's level and put one hand to her forehead. Still warm, not alarmingly so, the tail end of a fever rather than the height of one. "How are you feeling?" "Bad," Lily said, with the honest simplicity of a child who had not yet learned to say fine when she wasn't. "My throat hurts." "I know, come on." Sophie took her hand. "Let's get you back to bed." She took Lily back to her room, settled her in, got her water, sat on the edge of the bed while Lily talked in the wandering, slightly delirious way of feverish children, about school, about Biscuit the Spaniel, about a song she'd heard somewhere that she couldn't remember the words to, but could hum. Sophie listened to all of it, answered when answers were wanted, and sat with the quiet when Lily finally drifted back towards sleep. Standing in the doorway of Lily's room, she looked at this small person in the nightlight's glow. The hedgehog pajamas, the assembled stuffed animals, Gerald in his position of highest authority, and felt something move through her that was so specific and so large that she stood still with it for a moment, just feeling it. She hadn't planned to love Lily. You never planned the specific ones. They arrived without asking permission, took up space in the exact shape they needed, and then it was done, and the space was theirs, and there was no version of the future you were building that they weren't in. She went back to the kitchen. Ethan was standing at the counter, second bowl of soup in hand, watching her come back with the expression that he'd mostly stopped managing when it was just the two of them. "She's asleep," Sophie said. "Thank you," he said. And then, "Sophie." She stopped. He set the bowl down. He looked at her with the careful, direct attention that was his specific version of being completely present. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I'm going to say it plainly because I've spent enough of the past year not saying things plainly." She waited. "I'm in love with you," he said. That's it. That's what I needed to say. The kitchen was quiet. The building was quiet. Lily was asleep down the hall. She looked at him for a moment. At this man who had stopped a car in the rain because it was the decent thing to do, who had made cereal in the morning and said, "You got it on your own," and meant it, who kept drawings in his desk drawer and had learned through 4 years of loss and single parenthood and the specific grinding work of continuing to continue, at this man who was not easy or simple and who had chosen her with the same deliberate, clear-eyed intention that he brought to every important thing. "I know," she said, not dismissively, with the particular warmth of someone who had seen it, had been watching it build, had been afraid of it, and then afraid to say she saw it, and then finally just honest about both. "That's all?" he said. "No." She crossed the kitchen, stood in front of him. "I'm in love with you too. I've been, for a while. I didn't say it because I was still convincing myself it was safe to." "Is it?" he said. "Safe?" She thought about that. The honest answer, which she was practicing. "No," she said. "Probably not. But I've decided I don't actually want safe. I want real." She looked at him. "This is real." He put both arms around her and she let him, let herself be held in the specific, unhurried way that felt different from every other version of this that she'd experienced before. Not the performed tenderness, not the version designed to produce a particular response, just the thing itself. Two people standing in a kitchen on a Wednesday night with a sick child down the hall and soup on the counter and the rain starting again outside, holding on. She cried, briefly. Not from sadness, from the specific, undignified relief of a thing that had been held tightly for a long time, finally being let go. She was not entirely pleased about the crying, because she was a person who preferred to experience emotions without providing a visual demonstration of them, but it happened anyway, and he didn't make it into something, which was exactly right. "Sorry," she said into his shoulder. "Don't be," he said. "I'm not a crier." "I know." "This is Sophie." His voice was quiet. "Just let it be." She let it be. By April, the question of the dog had been formally resolved in Lily's favor. Not Biscuit, Mrs. Holloway's sister had formed an attachment that rendered rehoming genuinely unkind. but a dog of similar type from a rescue organization that Lily had also located and presented in the folder, which turned out to contain more research than anyone had initially appreciated. The dog was a 2-year-old Cocker Spaniel mix named something unpronounceable by the rescue that Lily renamed Fletcher within approximately 40 seconds of meeting him, with the authority of someone who had been thinking about this for months and was prepared. Fletcher turned out to have a specific, immediate, and irrevocable attachment to Sophie, which Lily accepted with good grace and which Ethan found quietly hilarious. "He follows you," Ethan said, watching Fletcher arrange himself across Sophie's feet on the kitchen floor on a Sunday morning. "I know," Sophie said. She looked down at the dog. "I didn't do anything." "You gave him the corner of your toast. That was one time." "Dogs remember everything," Lily said from the table where she was drawing. "Gerald told me." "Gerald told you," Ethan said. "Gerald has excellent instincts," Sophie said, at the same moment. And she and Lily looked at each other, and Lily's face split into the full, unguarded grin of a child who was completely, uncomplicatedly happy. And Sophie felt the warmth of it land somewhere so specific and so central that it would have been frightening if it weren't so clearly right. This was the thing nobody told you about building a life with someone. Not the person you chose, but the entirety of what they came with. The people, the routines, the history, and the habits. The dog that sat on your feet. The small person with her mother's eyes who said true things in the language of 5-year-olds and called her stuffed rabbit's intuitions as evidence and had chosen Sophie without reservation from the first morning in the kitchen. The way children chose, completely. Without the protective qualifications that adults spent years developing and then spent more years trying to unlearn. Lily had never needed to unlearn it. She'd just looked at Sophie across the kitchen island on a November morning and decided, and that had been that. In May, Sophie moved out of the flat with the thin walls. She was clear with herself about what this meant and what it didn't mean. It didn't mean moving into the Chelsea penthouse. That conversation was ongoing and unhurried, and they were taking it at the pace it deserved, which was not the pace of urgency or the pace of romantic momentum, but the pace of two people who understood that the physical logistics of combining lives was one of the more honest tests of whether you actually wanted to combine them. She moved into a 1-bedroom flat in Bermondsey, her own, properly, the first she'd had by herself in years, better than the rented room, hers in the real sense. She had it painted the particular shade of warm white that she'd been thinking about since she'd first seen it in a design reference 3 years ago and filed it under someday. Someday had arrived. She called her mother on the day she got the keys. 1 bedroom, her mother said, in London, in Bermondsey. Is that nice? It's getting nicer, Sophie said. Good bones. Her mother made the small, careful sound that meant she was doing calculations Sophie couldn't see. And the man? Still there? And still good? Sophie stood in the empty flat, paint drying on the walls, afternoon light coming through the windows that looked onto a courtyard where someone had planted a small garden that was doing its April best. She thought about the soup she'd made on a Wednesday night. About "I'm in love with you," said plainly across a kitchen counter, because they'd both agreed plain was better. About Fletcher on her feet and Lily's unguarded grin and the note she still had somewhere, folded into the pocket of her November coat. Gerald was very reassuring. Yeah, she said. Still good. Her mother made the satisfied sound that didn't require elaboration. You sound different, her mother said. Better different. The good kind. You said that in February. It's more true now, her mother said. February was early. This is settled. Sophie looked at the light on the wall, at the space that was hers, that she'd worked for, that represented the accumulated evidence of 5 months of going in the right direction consistently enough that the direction had started to feel like a place. Yeah, she said, it is. In June, the Hartley campaign was shortlisted for 2 industry awards. The shortlisting named the creative team, which included Sophie's name in the second position after the creative director, which was accurate, and which Priya pointed out with the specific satisfaction of someone whose ongoing campaign for proper attribution had borne fruit. Sophie was in the conference room when Ethan told the team, a brief, characteristically understated announcement that ended with "the work speaks for itself, and so does the team that made it." She was sitting 3 seats down from him, and she did not look at him directly when he said it, and he did not look at her, and both of them were doing exactly the right thing by the professional space they were still careful about. She found a text from him on her phone afterward. Congratulations. Told you in November it wasn't a long shot. She typed back, You said you knew how I handled myself. That's different from knowing the work. I knew both, he replied. I just didn't say both. She smiled at her phone in the stairwell where nobody could see it and then went back to her desk. The award shortlisting triggered a conversation about the next cycle of campaigns. Sterling Global's Q3 pipeline was substantial, and the Hartley success had produced the particular momentum that successful campaigns produced, where clients who'd been on the fence moved off it in the favorable direction. Diana called Sophie into her office in the second week of June and offered her a senior creative lead role. Not a promotion exactly, more an acknowledgement of what had already organically become true over the past 7 months. New title, new rate, new scope. Sophie sat across from Diana and let her finish the full offer before saying anything. Can I ask you something? Sophie said. Diana waited. When you put me into the Hartley Steering Committee, Sophie said, that was month 3. I was still technically on probationary period. Yes, Diana said. Was that your call or his? Diana looked at her with the precise, unreadable expression she deployed when she was deciding how much to say. It was mine, she said finally. He mentioned your name once, in passing, as worth watching. The steering committee was my decision. Sophie absorbed this. The distinction mattered to her, had always mattered, from the first morning when he told her you got it on your own. The work had to be the work. The relationship, the thing that was also real and also important, could not be what moved the professional pieces. She'd been watching for the line carefully since November and she hadn't seen it crossed, but she'd needed to ask. Thank you, she said, for telling me. The role is yours because the work is yours, Diana said, in the tone of someone who was also aware of the line and had no interest in its being blurred. That's all. That's all I needed to know, Sophie said. She accepted the role. She told Ethan that evening that, not as a report to her employer, but as a person telling someone they loved about something good that had happened. They were in her new flat, which he'd been in 4 times now, and which had, incrementally, begun to acquire the small evidence of dual occupancy. A jacket over a chair, a coffee mug he'd claimed by repeated use, Fletcher's lead on the hook by the door because Fletcher had, somewhere in the past month, begun to travel between the 2 households with the equanimity of an animal who had assessed both situations and found them satisfactory. Diana made the steering committee call herself, she said. I checked. He looked at her. I know she did. You didn't push it. I said your name once in a general conversation about the team, he said. Diana doesn't take suggestions from me about her department. She takes information. I know, Sophie said. I needed to ask. I know you did. He said it without any edge. The thing she'd learned about him, the specific, important thing, was that he understood why she needed to verify things. He didn't take it as a reflection on him. He took it as accurate information about her history and what it had made necessary, and he gave her the space to verify because he understood that verification was how trust was built rather than assumed. Senior creative lead, she said. I know, Diana told me. He picked up his coffee. Are you pleased? She thought about it. The honest version. Yes, she said. I'm genuinely pleased because I know it's mine. It was always going to be yours, he said. The question was just timing. She looked at him across the small table in her Bermondsey flat, in the warm light of a June evening, London doing its summer thing outside the windows. Longer days, the particular almost warmth of an English summer that refused to fully commit, but was trying. She looked at this man who had stopped a car on a side street 7 months ago and had said, with the complete simplicity of someone who meant exactly what they said, it's what any decent person would do. She'd met decent people before. She'd also met people who were skilled at appearing decent, which was a different and more expensive thing. The difference, she'd learned, was visible in the accumulation of small moments, in whether the consistency held not just in the big declarations, but in the Tuesday evenings and the sick child Wednesdays, and the honest answers to questions that could have been deflected. His had held. Hers had too, she thought. She'd done the work. She'd stayed honest when honesty was uncomfortable. She'd asked the question about the steering committee because the answer mattered more than appearing to already trust it. She'd moved into her own flat before moving into his life, because she needed to know she could stand on her own ground and choose his ground from a position of choice rather than need. She was not the woman on the pavement in the rain anymore. She was also, and this was the important part, not trying to be a version of herself that hadn't been there. The pavement was part of the story. The thin walls and the November coat and the bag she wouldn't let go of and the interview she needed to win. All of it was part of what she'd been building toward, even when it felt like being buried. You couldn't get to the thing you were building toward without going through what had to be gone through. That was the unromantic, inconvenient, completely true version of it. Lily turned 6 in July. The party was held in the Penthouse, Lily's specific request, citing the roof terrace and its skyline view as essential to her birthday vision. A vision she had presented to Ethan in early June with the project management confidence of someone who had watched adults run meetings for her entire conscious life and had absorbed the methodology. Sophie had helped with the planning, which mostly meant sitting with Lily on weekend mornings and listening to the plan evolve with the supportive attention of someone who understood that the point was not to produce a perfect party, but to let Lily produce her party. She'd offered 3 concrete suggestions: the cake design, the activity station, and a very specific playlist of songs Lily liked that Sophie had compiled over 6 months of paying attention, and had held all 3 opinions lightly enough that when Lily changed her mind about 2 of them, she changed with her without fuss. The day of the party, Sophie arrived at 9 in the morning with Fletcher on his lead and the cake she'd collected from the bakery, and the day went the way days went when children were in charge of the occasion, with the particular chaotic joy of something that wasn't organized enough to be managed, but was held together by the energy of everyone present wanting it to go well. Midday, in the brief window between the outdoor games and the food, Sophie found herself standing at the edge of the terrace with a glass of water, looking out over London. The city in July was different, warmer, the Thames catching light, the buildings less oppressive than in winter. It was the same skyline she'd seen from the tube window in November when she'd arrived, the same city that had felt enormous and hostile and designed for people who already knew where they were going. It didn't feel like that anymore. It felt, in the specific and unguarded way of something true, like home. Not because it had become easier. London didn't become easier. It became familiar, which was different. Because she had made it hers. Because the familiar had accumulated until it outweighed the strange. Because she had shown up every day, done the work, told the truth, chosen the people worth choosing, and built something out of it. Ethan came to stand beside her. He had a glass of juice, the children's party variety, because Lily had distributed the juice cups with the impartial authority of a small event coordinator, and he'd accepted his without complaint. He stood close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, looking out over the same city. "You okay?" he said. "Better than okay," she said. He looked at her profile for a moment. She could feel him looking in the way she'd learned to feel it. Not surveillance, not assessment, just attention. The particular quality of being seen by someone who was looking because they wanted to, not because they needed something from the looking. "She asked me something this morning," he said. Sophie turned to look at him. "She asked if you were going to live with us." His voice was measured, but the measurement was deliberate, covering the quality of someone saying a significant thing carefully. I told her that was a conversation for later. She said that was a yes. Sophie looked at him. "She's not wrong," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "No," he said. "She's not." They looked at each other in the July sunlight, with the party going on behind them and the city below, and the 7 months of distance traveled between November rain and this particular moment on a terrace in summer, and neither of them said the specific thing that the moment contained because the moment contained it well enough on its own and didn't need to be spoken to be real. "Ask me in September," she said. "September," he said. "Give the flat until September. It was important to have it." "I know," he said. "I know it was." "Well, after September, it's a—" She stopped, looked out at London. "After September, I think the answer is yes." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned back to look at the party. At Lily, currently in the middle of a game that appeared to involve Fletcher and a considerable amount of lateral movement, laughing in the complete consuming way of a child who was exactly where she wanted to be. "She's going to be unbearable about being right," he said. "She'll earn it," Sophie said. "Yes," he said. "She will." Fletcher, from across the terrace, located Sophie by some sixth sense mechanism and crossed to her at a trot, arranging himself across her feet with the settled finality of an animal who had made a permanent decision. Lily followed, slightly breathless, and took Sophie's hand without asking. The practiced, unconscious gesture of someone for whom the hand was already a known quantity, already claimed, already familiar. The three of them stood at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the city, and Ethan moved to stand on Lily's other side, and they were four, counting Fletcher, who had strong feelings about being counted, in the warm July afternoon with London laid out below them. Sophie thought about the woman on the pavement in November, about the bag she hadn't let go of, about the morning after when she'd sat at this man's kitchen island and talked to his daughter about cereal, and felt, for just a moment before she'd let caution reassemble itself, something that she hadn't known how to name then. She knew how to name it now. It was the feeling of a place that fit, not perfectly. There was no perfectly. And she'd stopped wanting perfectly, because perfectly was a story, and she was living in the real version, with its complications and sick Wednesdays and dogs on her feet, and professional conversations that required navigating carefully, and a heart that was still, even now, doing the ongoing work of trusting what it found trustworthy. The real version was better than any other version she'd imagined, not because it was easier, because it was hers. Lily tugged her hand. Sophie. Yes. Do you think Fletcher knows it's my birthday? Sophie looked down at the dog, who was sitting on her feet with the regal indifference of an animal who is aware of most things and selectively responsive to all of them. I think Fletcher knows everything, she said. He just doesn't tell us. Lily considered this with the full seriousness it deserved. Then, satisfied, like Gerald. Exactly like Gerald, Sophie said. Lily nodded, leaned into Sophie's side with the unself-conscious weight of someone completely comfortable in where they were leaning, and turned back to watch the city. The afternoon held them. The summer held them. London, enormous and imperfect and entirely itself, stretched out to the horizon in every direction, full of 10,000 stories running simultaneously in its streets, love and loss, and people finding each other and losing each other and starting over and trying again, the whole ongoing, unresolved human thing. In one of those stories, a woman who had arrived on a rainy night with everything she owned in a bag was standing in the sun on a terrace, holding a 6-year-old's hand, her shoulder against the arm of a man who had stopped a car because it was the decent thing to do. No story ended cleanly. She knew that. There would be difficult weeks and disagreements that needed working through, and mornings where the patience ran thin, and evenings where the old fear surfaced briefly before being recognized for what it was. There would be the ongoing work of two imperfect people choosing each other across the ordinary and extraordinary demands of daily life, which was the only version of this that was real. She was ready for that version. She had, in some ways, been building toward it her whole life. Through the wrong turns and the betrayals and the pavement in November and the hostel and the borrowed pen at the reception desk. All of it had been, without her knowing it, practice. For this. For here. For choosing to stay.